Like I'm sure all of you, I wish we were in person because I feel like it's a lot easier to give this presentation in person. Typically when I do these types of presentations for the county master gardeners, I'm able to bring live plants and we're able to go through a little bit of identification characteristics with the different turf grasses and some of the common lawn weeds that we find. So we're missing that today, but I'll try to do the best I can with talking about some of those concepts. But I definitely appreciate being here. I think I know some of you. I've been at the Institute of Applied Agriculture for 3 academic years now, so August will be the start of my 4th academic year. In addition to being the lecturer and advisor for the Turfgrass Management Program at the IAA, I am also an agronomist at the Grassroots exhibit at the U.S. National Arboretum. Prior to moving to Maryland, I was the Grassroots coordinator for 4 years there, and Grassroots is an acre exhibit built for interactively learning about turfgrass best management practices. So that's a fun thing to have as a project there at the U.S. National Arboretum. So today, let me go ahead and let's see, scoot down to my next slide here. Okay.
Geoff, that's an awesome bio. There were a couple things that I didn't know about you in there too, so that was awesome. Thanks for sharing.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I've been real fortunate to have been in the industry a while, and it's been great to be in the horticulture industry, and I'm very grateful to be here today. As many of you are probably familiar, the Turfgrass section of your Master Gardener's Handbook is a great resource, and I will be kind of paralleling that today. But obviously, this is you've got a lot of great written information at your fingertips there with the Master Gardener's Handbook.
Hey Geoff, can we put your slides into full screen?
Oops. Okay. Yep. Yeah. Let me do that. Slideshow. Okay. Let me do that. Okay. There we go. That'll make it easier to see. Yep. Thank you for the reminder. Okay. So what I want to focus today on are best management turfgrass maintenance practices. So when we think about turfgrass maintenance practices, really we've got 5 practices, or sometimes what we call cultural practices that we focus on with turfgrass management. So the first of which is variety selection, and I would say that this is truly one of the most important. We have all heard the concept of right plant, right place within our landscape design principles. So this goes for turfgrass as well. We want to make sure that we pick the right species for the right space and for the right use. And within picking the right species, we also want to pick improved varieties that have done well in our Maryland area. So I'll talk about that a little bit to begin with. But we also want to talk about mowing, watering, fertilizing. I put aerating and thatching together because those are very closely related from an agronomic standpoint. And then the idea is that if we can do these first 5 correctly, we spend less time on pest management. And after all, we all enjoy gardening because we like plants, not because we enjoy doing pest management. So being able to do these 5 cultural practices correctly really lead more into better plant health care, which makes for a sturdier plant and a more persistent plant and a more functional plant for our landscapes. Just like any other landscape plant, we definitely want to do be wary of a site evaluation before we're doing a planting. So obviously these things can include things like how shady or how sunny is that site, what's the slope or the aspect. Just because you have a slope doesn't mean it's going to be the same if it faces south versus facing north. Certainly wet and dry conditions based upon the soils and based upon the topography of a site are important. Looking at soil texture and being able to do a soil test, whether it's an established lawn on a regular basis about every 3 years, or on a new site at the initial, before the initial planting, is going to be important, because that gives us an idea of soil texture, gives us an idea of the nutrient availability within that soil. And if we're looking at either a renovation or an older site, a lot of times the species that are present will give us an indication of the conditions. So as we talk about weed species a little bit later, we find that there's a lot of weed species that like certain conditions. So a lot of times we can glean information from the species that are present within a given site. For lawns, we're also looking at, what's the use? What's the traffic? We want to make sure that a lawn in our landscape is going to be functional. So sometimes I go by and, you'll see acres, yards with an acre and acres of lawn. And you think about, okay, is this functional? So is it, instead of maintaining all of this area, is it possible to turn some of it into a field and have a little bit less maintenance? Especially when we're looking at lower inputs for landscapes, and trying to be more, more frugal with our resources. Obviously, with the traffic issue, turf grasses are a group of plants that have the best ability to withstand foot traffic within our landscapes, and so that's one of the main reasons that we do use turf grasses in our landscapes. And then looking at that, how that ties into functionality. Certainly we don't, we want to look at, how does this turf grass fit into the rest of our plantings? Is it used as a landscape element to kind of connect other plantings within the landscape? Is it used for entertaining, where it is an area that will withstand a lot of foot traffic? So keeping an eye out for that functionality, and how that interacts with right plant, right place, is a really important part of looking at turfgrass management and how lawns connect with the rest of the landscape on a given property. So if we think about some turfgrass quality components, I think that if I asked typical homeowners about, what comprises turfgrass quality, a lot of folks would probably say color. And in fact, with a lot of my homeowner workshops, that's what they usually say. Now, with my more sophisticated audiences, like the master gardeners or like professionals, a lot of times folks will say density. Folks will say pest tolerance. But we're really looking at a number of different components that comprise what we think of as quality as turfgrass scientists. So as we research and develop new varieties, we're looking at all these different things to try to look at, can we have a high quality, functional turfgrass while trying to minimize necessary inputs. So all these things play a role between density, drought tolerance, persistence, pest tolerance to diseases or to insects, colors, one of these aspects, and then uniformity and wear tolerance. So my point here is that color, well, a lot of people think of color as equal to quality. Color is just one aspect of turfgrass quality. Okay, so when we talk about Turfgrass ID, I know that for a lot of people, this is definitely more challenging than identifying a lot of our broadleaf landscape plants. Part of the reason for this is that turfgrass plant, when it's mowed, is going to be a lot smaller, and so the morphological features that we see for identification are going to be a lot smaller as well. So I just wanted to, again, this is where I really wish we were in person. I could show you some of these some of these details with identification. But I know that you as master gardeners, a lot of times you'll be at a farmer's market or some other event, and folks will bring up a clump of grass from their lawn and ask you a little bit about what it is. A couple, and again, this is in your handbook, but a couple things I did want to point out. Obviously we have the grass plant's going to grow from what's called the crown. So this is where its primary meristem is, and that's why we can mow grasses, because we're not damaging the growing point here, which is at the surface of the soil. Obviously we have the roots within this too, growing out from the crown. We have lateral stems, so these can be in the form of rhizomes, which are going to be underground lateral stems and can give rise to new plants. Or on here, we don't have it on here, but a stolon would be an above ground lateral stem that can also give rise to new plants. And then if we have a tiller, this would be developing within the leaf sheath as opposed to outside of the leaf sheath, like a rhizome or stolon. So this tiller gives rise to increasing the size of a given plant. And obviously it's very important to know, do we have a grass that creates rhizomes or stolons, or do we have a grass that only tillers? And this plays into the growth habit and largely, and usually the subsequent density that grass is capable of. So we've got emerging from the crown, we've also got the leaf sheath, and then development of the leaf blade. We'll notice, we'll talk a little bit about the ligule and not on here, but oracles with regards to being able to identify different species. So if we look at the leaf blade, if we look closely, we'll see that there's different shapes and textures to the leaf blade. So sometimes that leaf blade can actually be a little hairy, or what they call pubescent in a technical term. So our warm season grasses like zoysia grass or Bermuda grass are going to have little hairs on the leaves. So that's a good indication that you likely have a warm season grass. In our area, that's a good indication. And then you also have different shaped tips. So you might have a smooth tip that's kind of boat shaped here by my arrow, kind of a boat shaped, or you might have a smooth tip that's kind of blunt at the end of it here. So the other thing I want to point out is that in some species you can see a lot of veins running the length of the leaf blade, and then in other times you can only see, without the use of a microscope, really only see one mid vein. So tall fescue, you'll be able to see many veins. Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass, typically just one vein that you can easily see running down the back of the leaf blade. So we also look at vernation types. So this is a big, really key indicator in helping to identify grasses. So we can have a folded vernation. And so this is a way that the leaf blade kind of emerges from the leaf sheath. So this can be folded, where it's very easy to kind of fold that leaf together, or it can be rolled. So tall fescue is typically going to have a rolled leaf vernation. Kentucky bluegrass will typically have a folded leaf vernation. So that's one way that we can kind of tell tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass apart. We also look at collar. So and obviously these diagrams are really, if you're able to magnify this portion of the plant, several fold. So you can have divided collar, or broad collar, or narrow collar. And then we look at the ligule. So the ligule is a very small piece of tissue right at the junction of the leaf blade and the leaf sheath. So in some grasses we do not have a ligule at all. Some grasses kind of have a hairy ligule, and then some are smooth and what they call membranous. So some of these too can be very prominent ligules, or some of them can be, very short or even absent. So these are all different types of ligules um, that can be seen. And then the auricles are actually, again, another piece of tissue of the plant. This kind of is an extension of the leaf blade, um, wrapping around to some extent the leaf sheath. So we can have those that are absent. You can have smaller auricles that barely come around the leaf sheath, and then some grasses we have very prominent prominent auricles, where you have these that's kind of referred to as clasping auricles, where they really come around that leaf sheath. And then, as I mentioned, looking at growth habits, so we've got a tiller, and this would be a new plant, essentially, enlarging of a current plant. So this would be a daughter plant emerging eventually from a mother plant, but this is within the sheath, so it's very close to the sheath of the original mother plant. And then we have rhizomes, which are below ground lateral stems. New plants can emerge from nodes on these rhizomes, and then likewise new plants can emerge from nodes on the stolons, which are going to be above ground lateral stems. So you can imagine that if you have a grass that has one or the other of these lateral stems, that you have a greater capacity for that grass to spread out and recover from stress. If you have a grass that has both stolons and rhizomes, it has an increased ability to be able to fill in. Or the flip side of that has an increased ability to be aggressive. Obviously, grasses that are going to be able to recover and recuperate by filling in are also grasses that can potentially be aggressive where we don't want them. So those are all kind of considerations. So examples of grasses that have rhizomes and stolons in our area would be Bermuda grass or zoysia grass, and then a cool season grass that has just rhizomes would be Kentucky bluegrass. Tall fescue just has tillers. So the flip side of that is that if we have an area of tall fescue that gets worn out, we need to be able to overseed that area, because we're not going to be able to depend on the tall fescue grass to creep into a new area very, very quickly. So within the Mid-Atlantic, we have three primary species that we use the most within lawns. Tall fescue is going to be what we find in probably 90+% of our lawns. We also have fine fescue and zoysia grass, and I'm going to walk through these a little bit, each of these. So the interesting thing about Maryland is that we are, as you know, kind of right where warm meets cold climatically within our nation. And so for a warm season grasses, things like zoysia grass, Bermuda grass, St. Augustine grass, these are really more adapted to the warm season areas of our country. So this would be the Gulf Coast and then all the way over to the desert Southwest. For the cool season grasses like Kentucky bluegrass, Persian ryegrass, tall fescue, these would be, of course, across the northern tier from New England, the upper Northeast, upper Midwest, Intermountain region, and then over to the Pacific Northwest. So we, of course, here in Maryland are smack dab in what we call the transition zone, where we have relatively cold winters and relatively hot summers. And so we can grow both warm season and cool season grasses, but neither of these groups effectively well throughout the whole growing season. So this makes for a real challenge in our area because with cool season grasses, we're facing a lot of stresses. during the heat of the summer, and with warm season grasses, you're facing dormancy for 4 to 5 months of the cooler time of the year. So for tall fescue, we want to be able to look for more specifically turf type tall fescue when we're looking for seed. So tall fescue is going to be adapted for sunny areas, not so much shady areas, can withstand a little bit of light shade. And within this, I don't have a good picture of this, but again, your book covers this a little bit more. You're actually going to have a rolled leaf vernation as that leaf blade emerges from the leaf sheath. The other thing too, and I don't know if you all can see this here, but there's a couple, you can see the veins running lengthways on the leaf blade. So these are going to be very, very prominent if you're able to look at this close up. The other thing with tall fescue from an identification standpoint is a lot of times if you rub your thumb and your forefinger down the edge of the tall fescue plant, it kind of feels like a sharp edge, like a little bit of serration there. So those are a couple identifying characteristics of tall fescue. As mentioned before, this is going to be a bunch type grass that only grows by tillering. So if we have areas that get worn out, we need to be able to reseed, overseed those to increase density. Our vine fescues are typically what we find in a shady mix at the hardware store or the garden center store. They're called fine fescues because they do have a very fine leaf blade. And within this fine fescue group, we find 4 main fescues between hard fescue, chewing fescue, creeping red fescue, and sheep fescue. In our area, through our research at the University of Maryland, the hard fescue of these 4 has been the most persistent and consistent performer. So I usually recommend if folks are looking for a fine fescue, they try to find a mix. They either try to find straight up hard fescue or a mix with a high percentage of hard fescue. And again, a lot of times these are marketed as a shady mix. And then thirdly, we have zoysia grass. This is a warm season grass. I think a lot of folks are probably familiar with this. You know, certainly less than 10% of our yards in the area, but you know, it tends to over the years kind of creep out. So you'll see pockets where, you know, maybe you have several neighbors together who might have zoysia grass because it's crept out over the years. Again, this grows by both stolons and rhizomes. And so while not a particularly fast grower, over time these can be invasive if they're getting into zoysia grass, getting into flower beds. And so because of that, being able to edge those flower beds on a regular basis is going to be an important part of trying to keep that zoysia grass at bay over the long term. Couple other grasses that you will find in your Master Gardener's Handbook are Bermuda grass, and this is another warm season grass that happens to be pretty aggressive warm season grass. Because of this aggressiveness and ability to fill in areas, it's really well adapted for athletic fields. So you're seeing more and more athletic fields in the area going to using Bermuda grass. Traditionally, Bermuda grass would winter kill a lot in Maryland. We now have some more, we have some hardier varieties that are a little bit more cold tolerant. So we do still sometimes find that we have winter kill, but the benefits for an athletic field and the aggressiveness on an athletic field kind of outweigh the risk of winter injury. Sometimes you'll also see this on home lawns on the Eastern Shore, particularly once you get down towards Salisbury or Ocean City with milder winters. Kentucky bluegrass, typically in Central Maryland, I don't recommend going with a straight up Kentucky bluegrass lawn Kentucky bluegrass is more disease prone than tall fescue, and it needs more fertilizer to perform well. So typically you'll see the good part of Kentucky bluegrass is that it does have rhizomes, so it can kind of creep out and fill in areas that are thin. So typically we use this on high-end athletic fields or in mixtures with tall fescue. You will see a couple high-end lawns that are straight Kentucky bluegrass. So, Camden Yards, Nats Park, down in Virginia, the Kennedy lawn at Arlington National Cemetery. So it's more of a high-end grass. That said, as you get up into the mountains, if you get up into Allegheny County, Garrett County, with the cooler temps, cooler summers up there, we find Kentucky bluegrass a little bit more adapted once you get west of Hancock in the state. And then perennial ryegrass, we do not recommend this at all for home lawns. It's a grass that's pretty disease prone. And what we find is that it's typically used on golf courses. And its claim to fame is that it has very quick germination. So a lot of our older golf courses use perennial ryegrass. We have a little bit better grasses now, but this is typically where we find perennial ryegrass. Okay, so these are, you have this chart in your handbook, kind of looking at a summary of these. So I'm not gonna spend too much time. One of the claims to fame of perennial ryegrass, and one of the things that makes it very tempting to use, is that it germinates very quickly. But I think in the long run, you're running into, you can put out something that's going to germinate quickly, but it's also going to die quickly once you get into disease time of the summer. So how do you pick the best variety? I've talked about, putting the right plant in the right place. How do you pick the best variety within that? So we at the University of Maryland do turfgrass variety trials. If you've ever been to Turfgrass Field Day, you see that we've got hundreds and hundreds of plots out there that we look at these grass varieties and evaluate these through the season. And so Virginia Tech also has a very similar program, and just about every year, I know that Dr. Turner, Dr. Goatley try for every year. They kind of meet, compare data, and then come up with a Maryland, Virginia recommended variety list. So this is a screenshot of last year's Technical Bulletin 77. Again, I know that Dr. Turner tries to update this every year. And so within this, you go down a few pages and you find turf type tall fescue. So you have both the proven turf type tall fescue cultivars, and these are cultivars that have been evaluated for at least 3 years and have proven to do well in our area. And you also have some promising ones that are have only been evaluated for less than 3 years, but so far so good. They're looking pretty good. So I guess bottom line with this is that I would really recommend folks, if you're overseeding or you're doing a new tall fescue yard, really try to get into this publication, take a look at these cultivars, and try to find cultivars that are on our Maryland, Virginia recommended list.
Geoff, we had a question. Are any of the turf grasses native to Maryland?
So these tall fescue is not native to Maryland. Zoysia grass is native to Eastern Asia. Bluegrass is native to Europe. We do have one grass that we're working on at the USDA, National Arboretum Turfgrass Scientist is looking at it. And if folks want to look up the species and Latin binomial there, it's called Danthonia spicata. So that's the Latin name, and then the common name is actually called poverty oatgrass. This is actually a native to 46 states, including Maryland. If you've ever been up hiking on the Appalachian Trail, you'll find it a lot on the sides of the trail. So it does really well in poor soils, no fertility. What we've had at the Arboretum, we mow it maybe once a month. So this is a grass that I think would be a great native for a home lawn. The big issue now is that the seed is extremely, extremely expensive because it's like a lot of native grasses. It's not a good seed producer. So what we find is you can go out and buy tall fescue for, $3 a pound, somewhere $3-4 a pound, and for Danthonia, unfortunately, it costs about $325 a pound. So typically, that's pretty cost prohibitive for the average homeowner.
Got it.
So the research that Dr. Warnke is doing over the USDA is trying to figure out how can we get better seed production, better seed harvesting out of this particular species, because it's a hard as nail species, and the fact that it's a native, has a lot of benefits.
Excellent. Okay. And then also related to kind of choosing the type of grass, have you noticed a change in the types of grass that are doing better due to the effects of climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I get asked a lot at the Arboretum by people visiting, what grass would I have for my lawn? And if I had, ironically, I just bought a townhouse that's new to me. It still has a tall fescue lawn, but I would do a zoysia grass lawn because it really, you think about when people enjoy their lawns, it's typically April to October. And of course, it's going to go dormant after the first frost, but it's just really a great grass with lower fertility requirement, lower water requirement. Zoysia grass is very dense. So once it's established, it has, a lot of great benefits. Doesn't really get disease. It doesn't really have insect problems. It's dense to keep the weeds out. So in zoysia grass, we've got a couple newer varieties in the last few years. So I would encourage people to think about zoysia grass. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to establish via seed. So typically you're looking at sprigs or looking at sod. And if you're looking at sod, it's expensive. If you're looking at sprigs, you're looking at some time for those sprigs to kind of grow together. But I encourage people to look at it as 10 or 15, 20-year investment, and the fact that you're going to have a high-quality lawn with relatively minimal inputs. So yeah, the other thing we see with the tall fescue is that we're now seeing an additional disease that we only used to see down in North Carolina on tall fescue called gray leaf spot. Now we're seeing a little bit more in the Maryland area over the last 2 or 3 years. So that's kind of one of the unfortunate things about really hotter Septembers. I think in the last couple of years, we really had some warm Septembers, and this gray leaf spot happens to be a late summer disease. If it comes in on August and then it gets cooler in September, it's not a big deal. But when you have the heat kind of persisting through September, that's an issue. So,
okay. And then let's see, we've got one more kind of related to choosing the type. Is the rhizome type of grass seed like Titan better than the tiller type in Maryland?
Okay, so yes. And the reason for that is that the rhizomes will help with density. They'll help with recovery. If you have stress, whether that's foot traffic stress or drought stress, from a recovery standpoint, those rhizomes will help. So the only cool season grass that we have in Maryland with rhizomes is Kentucky bluegrass. So the flip side of that is that Kentucky bluegrass is a little bit more disease prone than tall fescue is. So all things being equal, yeah, I'd rather have a rhizome grass. But the fact that I'm more disease prone makes me kind of lean towards tall fescue if I'm going with a cool season grass. And then if I went with zoysia grass, I've got both rhizomes and stolon, which is nice, but it's slower to establish. So all these grasses kind of have benefits and drawbacks. And as I mentioned, with us being right between cold and warm, it's, there's arguments to be had on both sides.
Got it. Okay. Excellent. And there was a question about the name of the Maryland grass you suggested. So we'll put a link in the chat box so that folks can look that one up on their own.
Yeah, you know what? I should just put it, you know what? Let me type it in the chat real quick here.
Okay.
Let me go, let me go to everyone. And that way you have the spelling.
Yeah.
And then I'll put so I put the Latin name first.
Perfect.
And then the common name in parentheses second. So I just sent that to everybody. Oh gosh, it's an A on the end of spagata, sorry.
Okay. Got it. Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you. All right.
Yes.
So we'll keep going. We'll do other questions later.
Great. So, if you go down here, you look at, okay, I want to try to find these cultivars. So, the question is, how do you find these cultivars? And a lot of times what you find is that, at least within our area, they're easier to find if you go to the professional distributors. So typically landscape professionals are going to have access to the better varieties because they're a little bit more expensive. But when you're buying 50 or 100 pounds of it at a time, you have kind of this economy of scale as a landscape professional. And so the better varieties are going to be more like $4 or $5 a pound, as opposed to the cheaper varieties that you buy at Home Depot, $2 or $3 a pound. My argument would be that, I shouldn't say Home Depot, the big box stores. My argument would be that for an extra couple dozen dollars, I feel like there's a lot of benefit in going out to find these improved varieties. So, let's see if I can. No, my screen's stuck here. Uh-oh.
You might be still in Zoom, so click back on your PowerPoint screen because it won't change the slide if you're still, if you have Zoom selected as your program.
I think let's see. Sharing.
I mean, woo!
Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah, I think I still have the chat box open. So I don't want to. I hate to.
Your slides more.
What's
you
that?
have to share your screen again.
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I not?
That's okay. Yeah, we just see you. We don't see your slides.
Okay. Let me get back to there. Share screen. Back to that. Share.
And then just go from current slide.
And then go from current slide. We're back. Are we back? Are we good?
Yes, that looks perfect. Thank you.
Great. So I hate to kind of, it's kind of tricky because I don't want to endorse any one or two or three companies, but by the same token, I want to provide information of, okay, so Geoff, you're saying go buy good quality seed. Well, where can you find that? And so typically you can find that with our professional distributors like Site One, Newsom Seed, Chesapeake Valley Seed. I know a lot of the kind of locally owned garden centers will also tend to have better, the better varieties. So they have taken the time to really go out, do the research, try to kind of create their own blend and have better varieties. So I would say, if you're trying to find high quality seed, seek out a professional distributor or seek out your locally owned garden center. And those are typically good places to find this high quality seed with varieties that are on the recommended list. Okay, so just a quick a graphic here on cool season grass growth. I think a lot of us have kind of seen this, but maybe we haven't seen this in graphic form. So with our cool season grasses, so this could be tall fescue, we see the shoot growth kind of emerging from a dormant or semi-dormant winter. We have this big flush of growth in spring typically, although we didn't see a huge flush of growth this spring because it was so cool. Things were a little bit more tempered out. And then in the summer, we typically see a downturn in the amount of leaf growth with hotter temperatures. Typically, drier conditions are accompanied with hotter temperatures, typically, but not always. And then in the fall, we have another little bump in shoot growth. So big thing here is that, with shorter days and moderate temperatures, we get some good root growth in the fall. And so we typically look to try to do most of our fertilization for cool season grasses in the fall, because that sets us up for a good season for next year and helps with root growth. So like a lot of plants, the key to really good persistence is looking at and concentrating on what we can do to help root growth and density. And so for warm season grasses, as most of you know, with with zoysia grass, it goes into a complete dormancy through the winter. It will start to green up sometime around April or so, and then grow great through the summer. It really enjoys temperatures in the 80s to low 90s. And then as we get into the fall, with shorter days, cooler nights, it will start to have less shoot growth. And then with the first hard frost, we'll go straw dormant as we get into late October, early November, depending on where you are in the state. So for different grasses, we're going to have different mowing heights. For cool season grasses, we usually want to try to have a little bit higher mowing height in the summer. And for warm season grasses, a little bit higher height in the spring or fall. So for tall fescue, we're looking at a range between 3 and 3.5 inches. For zoysia grass, if you've got straight up zoysia grass, it's really good to mow it a little bit lower at about 1.5 inches, 2 inches, because that helps to decrease the amount of thatch that you have over the long term. But a lot of people in Maryland are mowing zoysia grass 3 inches, just because that's kind of, you might have a mix of zoysia and tall fescue in the same yard, and you kind of got to mow it at the same height. And then fine fescue, 3 to 3.5 inches. Usually we're mowing with the rotary mower. Occasionally, I guess folks are mowing, kind of with the old school reel mower. Always liked including this photo. My son is 2.5 in that picture, and he's 14 now, but always appreciate him getting out there to mow the lawn when he was 2.5. So mowing high, we find that we have greater traffic tolerance. Ultimately, we have deeper root growth, which is going to advocate for a more persistent stand, and also help with water conservation if we have better and deeper root growth. So keep in mind these ranges here. A lot of problems can be had if you're mowing tall fescue at, say, 2 inches or 2.5 inches. A lot of people, for some reason, want to go for the golf course look and really don't realize that the grasses that we have on athletic fields, grasses we have on the golf course, are different grasses. And so they're adapted to be mowed at lower mowing heights. Whereas for tall fescue, it's going to be a better, healthier grass at 3 to 3.5 inches. And so we see this within this diagram or sketch here. So taller grass, this happens to be a rhizomatous grass, so you can see the rhizomes there. Taller grass, deeper roots, shorter grass, a little bit shorter roots there. So, the key to getting our cool season grasses through the summer is going to be this deep root growth that we try to advocate for in the fall, especially. little bit in the spring, and then be able to get through the summer. Since with the heat, we're always producing roots and losing roots to death. But in the summer for cool season grasses, more roots are typically dying than they are growing. So we want to try to advocate for as deep a root system as we can for the long-term health of the grass. You think about mowing, really, I advocate, and a lot of turfgrass scientists advocate for what we call mulch mowing. Some people will call this grass cycling. This is where you basically return the clippings back to the turf. So with a lot of modern equipment, with mulch mowers that are designed to mulch mow, it's easier to do this, but you can also do this by having an older mower and just kind of inserting a plug into that grass catching chute so that you again move the clippings back down into the canopy. So being able to do this helps us to return the nutrients from the turf grass back into the system. Here you see Michigan State's done a lot of research looking at mulch mowing leaves. I see people all the time raking leaves in the fall, and really, especially if they're dry, you can just mulch mow these leaves. Of course, the leaves are going to have nutrients in them too. And from my perspective, it's going to be a lot better to try to return that plant material on site as opposed to raking it, collecting it, putting it in a bag, and then shipping it away for your municipality to deal with. So being able to mulch mow leaves or use leaves for a compost pile, I think is a great use of resources within our landscape. And really, because we're able to return these nutrients, we're gonna have better grass growth in the long term. 25 years ago, there's this big thing saying, "Oh, don't collect or don't mulch mow your clippings because clippings contribute to thatch." Well, we've since been proven that clippings, for the most part, are water. They're about 80% or so water, and then the rest nutrients and cellulose and hemicellulose, things that go into the structure of the leaf. So clippings do not contribute to thatch. Thatch actually develops based upon the growth habit of the grass and is a mix of intermingled layer of stems and roots between the green part and the soil part. So being able to return your clippings is great. I realize in the spring, maybe it's wet, maybe things are growing a lot. It's very, very difficult to mulch mow, and so I get that. Sometimes it's just easier to collect, but folks can mulch mow most of the time. That's going to be a benefit to keeping that plant material on site, to returning nutrients, etc. Also within turfgrass, there's something called the 1/3 rule. So typical recommendation is not to remove any more than 1/3 of the leaf blade at a given time. So if you're mowing at 3 inches, you want to make sure that you mow before you get beyond 4.5 inch leaf height. If things are really too high, you might want to even bump your mower up a little bit more and then lower it back to a normal height next time. Really, if you remove too much of the leaf blade at a given time and you're going into a stressful time of year, that really negatively impacts the plant's ability to photosynthesize. And so you're going to have something that kind of looks like this, where it looks like this particular mower has gone on the same path over time and just kind of developed these ruts. So they're essentially scalping down the middle there. And in the summer, this is going to take, if you scalp in the spring, it'll recover, within a week or so probably. But if you scalp in the summer, it might take, 2, 3, 4 weeks to really recover. The other thing that I think a lot of people overlook is how much sharp blades help. So if you haven't replaced or sharpened your blades in a while, making sure that you have a sharp blade so you get a really clean cut is going to be helpful for not only the appearance, but also to avoid this frayed look here. So with all this fraying It's not only does it not look good, it provides an opening for potential disease pathogens to the grass. So
So we did
you
have a
can.
couple questions about cutting. Is it best to mow with or without the bag from spring to summer, or should the cuttings be bagged only when it's excessively hot?
So I don't think there's any correlation between temperature um and mulching per se. Um, I think it's more in the spring if you have, let's say you're mowing at 3 inches and you've let the grass grow up to 4.5 and it's super wet and you've got a ton of clippings, and maybe it's easier to just bag at that point. But there's no real correlation between saying, oh, it's summer, I'm going to bag. Um, you should try to mulch mow as much as you can
Okay.
feasibly.
And that was another question was, would you mulch mow all grasses, including zoysia?
I would.
Okay,
Hmm.
great. And then how often should a commercial mowing company be sharpening their blades? And do they typically clean it in between their clients so they aren't carrying invasives between yards?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I used to work for a landscape company, we did not, we did not clean the mower between properties. I doubt that many landscape companies do that. It's just it's difficult because you're faced with, okay, where do I get the water to do that? It's kind of awkward to use a client's hose. If it's dry, you can certainly, one of the things they can do is lift it up and kind of use the blower to get the clippings out of it. But I don't think the average landscape uh, company does that.
Okay.
So, but speaking of cleaning, I do recommend homeowners try to wash out the underside of their mower every time, and really this helps from getting debris kind of stuck on there and kind of rusting issues depending on your mower. The other thing to think about is as that blade's spinning around, it's going to spin around easier if it's not impacted, if the airflow is not impacted by caked on grass. So if you think about professional facility managers, so not necessarily landscapers, but sports field managers, golf course managers, they're washing equipment off every time that it's used. Um, so for a homeowner, definitely encourage you all to try to do that, especially on the underside. Try to do this in an area where that water is going to soak into the ground. So try to get people away from doing it on a driveway or sidewalk or hardscape, because then that water's going to go down to the storm drain. It's got nutrients in it. It's got a little bit of hydrocarbons from the mower, from the gas. So if we can do that, if we can wash our mowers off, in a secluded section of the yard or in a mulch bed or something like that, get that little bit of debris going into the soil and not down the storm drain. That's going to be a best management practice for that. So same thing with clippings. Try to sweep your clippings, sweep your fertilizer back in the lawn. Don't just sweep it down the street to the storm drain, because those storm drains are going straight to our surface water. So we need to kind of steward, do our part in helping to clean surface water as it moves downhill. And then, while I'm at it, just kind of mentioning, trying to minimize our chemical and fertilizer storage. Be sure that, if you have turf care products, they're sealed up well. They're in a position where they're not going to spill easily. They're in a secure space, that's not going to be exposed to a lot of elements, and always follow label directions. So in my mind, there's a lot that we can do in our landscapes to, kind of further environmental stewardship of our spaces.
We had one more mowing question come in.
Yes.
When you said not to cut more than 1/3 of the grass blade at a time, does that mean you can immediately reset the blade lower and take another pass, or is there a certain amount of time you want to wait between mowing?
Yeah, good question. I would probably wait probably about 4 or 5 days at least. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
Now that said, I mean, you have a little bit more leeway in the spring when things are cool and not stressful. That 4 or 5 days, in my mind, would be kind of a May to September guideline, and maybe a little bit less in the spring.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so I know in Maryland we don't have a lot of in-ground irrigation systems. Typically, we're in a situation where we're having, showers or thunderstorms, every 5 to 10 days during the summer. So, a lot of times we don't need to add supplemental water. The other thing to think about is that tall fescue, of all the cool season grasses, tall fescue is one of our most drought tolerant. And so it can withstand some drought where it kind of goes into a kind of a semi-dormancy and then is able to recover once rain and irrigation is adequate again. So typically, rule of thumb is that we don't need any more than 1 inch of water per week in the heart of the summer. So June, July, August. In situations where we do water, we want to be able to water deeply and infrequently without creating puddles or runoff. Trying to figure out when to water. If you see symptoms like this, so this is a situation where we've got some mower traffic, we've got these competitions with the trees. Obviously, this is a golf course, but if your home lawn's starting to look like this, where you have this droughty appearance, I would say that this is kind of the second stage of drought there. So you might consider, trying to get some water on that deeply and infrequently. So what I mean by that is maybe adding 1/3 of an inch or 1/2 an inch via sprinkler, and then waiting 3, 4, 5 days, and then adding another 1/3 or 1/2 an inch. So some people, if you just water a little bit, and I've seen this with irrigation systems, they set the irrigation system for a little bit every day, and so that water doesn't get very far down into the root zone. It just sits on the surface. It also creates more humidity at the surface, which kind of fosters some of our disease fungi. So really, you're better off trying to get that water down deeper to try to help those roots that are down deeper in the soil. So while this is kind of a second stage of drought appearance, this would be an indication of a first stage. So you see here, kind of the onset of wilt here, where I've got my arrow, and you can kind of see, if you look closely, what we call footprinting. So this is where somebody's kind of walked across, and these footprints just don't bounce back. And typically when we step on the grass, if it's got enough water, it bounces right back. But when you start seeing this footprinting on your lawn, that's a pretty good indication that if you are going to water, that's probably the time to start watering. And like I said, with a lot of our tall fescue grasses, we can withstand it going into kind of a semi-dormancy, that kind of looks like this, and then it will bounce back. Now, that said, if you go into a severe dormancy, you can have loss of density, and then that kind of opens things up for weed encroachment. Some of our weeds are really drought tolerant, so if they have that opportunity to creep in and invade, that can be an issue if you let the lawn go absolutely completely dormant. And so you're faced with, personally, I'd rather use a little bit of water to keep things in good shape than be faced with, okay, I've got weeds, so now do I go hand pick or do I go spot spray with an herbicide? I'd much rather just use water judiciously to keep kind of a minimum, at least a minimum of growth kind of going for that lawn area. Really best to water in the morning if you can. If you're using a sprinkler with a water timer, um, that's helpful so that you don't just set it out there and you meant to water for 35 minutes and you get going and get in the house and get distracted and you're talking on the phone and the kids are yelling and everything, and next thing you know you're over watering for 2 hours. So water timer is helpful for folks who have automatic irrigation systems. Really encourage consistent maintenance. So being able to assess that water schedule on a regular basis, being able to inspect that system for leaks or breaks, and make sure that the sprinklers are functioning and aligned correctly, um, is an important thing. And I think that obviously within Maryland, we see more commercial properties that are more prone to have an automatic irrigation system than homeowner properties. Okay, so kind of moving on uh, in our maintenance practices here. When we think about airifying and dethatching, and again, I kind of put these in the same space. Um, for cool season grasses, we're looking at fall or spring. For warm season grasses, we're looking at doing this in May and August. And these are kind of our windows of opportunities because that's when these grasses are growing the best. So cool season grasses are going to grow the best, especially in fall, fall and spring, and then warm season grasses late spring through summer. So basically, with the aerification process, we're going through, and we've got these tines as the machine moves forward. You're going through, you're pulling out these cores, making holes, and these holes are allowing more oxygen to get through, and help with water penetration in the soil. They're also helping to relieve compaction that may have occurred through foot traffic over time. So the neat thing is that if you're doing this in fall, and this lawn here is kind of beat up. I mean, this one in the middle is kind of beat up. This offers an awesome time to be able to do a rejuvenation. So you're going in, you're making holes, and then if you go in and overseed, all those seeds, the seeds that fall in the holes have a special little nook that helps them germinate. So being able to airify and overseed in the fall is a really great thing to be able to do to help with consistent density. And really, when we start thinking about weed control, weeds are going to be opportunists. So if you're in a situation where you don't have good density, then you have more of an issue with weed encroachment. So really, biggest take-home message is you can do things that are going to help the roots, help the density. That's going to be beneficial for our turf grass plants in the long term. So looking at this aerating again, relieves the compaction, helps with water infiltration, helps with fertilizer infiltration. We're trying to get that water into the ground and not running off. We're also trying to get oxygen down to the roots. So as these soils get compacted and soil particles get closer together, there's less airspace in there. And being able to open that up is going to be able to help get air to the roots. And these primary windows of opportunity, again, are going to be in the spring and the fall for cool season grasses. If I had to choose one of those, I'd say fall. Because it provides an awesome opportunity to do some overseeding at the same time. During the spring, we're getting into the warmer weather months. We're getting into a higher sun angle. It's not quite as easy to seed in the spring. Can be done, but it takes a little bit more care and attention to do that seeding in the spring. So dethatching, really, the only real thatch producing grasses we have here for lawns in Maryland are bluegrass and zoysia grass. So this thatch layer is this intermingled layer of stems and roots that occurs between the verdure or the green part of the plant and the actual soil. So you kind of see this light brown portion right there that we refer to as the thatch. And so for the dethatching, we actually go in and use a dethatcher to kind of slice through this. And again, this is not an issue with tall fescue. What happens is that our lateral stems, like our rhizome stolons, really contribute to this thatch. And with tall fescue, we don't have any rhizomes or stolons, so we have a real minimal amount of thatch. But if you have zoysia grass, this is something to really consider. Maybe every 2 or 3 years, go in and do that dethatching to try to help get more air into the system, and then kind of reduce that bounciness of the grass that can kind of lead to unevenness of the mower, to where you get sometimes where it's mowing too low or getting bogged down. Being able to control that thatch is going to be important for those reasons. Before I get into lawn fertilization, let me just get a quick drink here of water while I'm.
Good idea. And we did have one question come in about aerating. Should lawns be aerated once a year or every other year?
Do it as often as you can.
Okay.
As often as your labor budget and your monetary budget allows. So if you could do it every year in the fall, that's awesome. Just to give you an example, a lot of our high-end sports fields will go in and aerify multiple times per year.
Okay.
They have got a lot more traffic than your home lawn does, but there's a lot of benefit to allowing air to get to the roots. Just
Great.
a tremendous amount of benefit. So I usually recommend at least every 3 years, but if you can do it more often than that, I think you're going to have a better lawn.
Excellent. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so I saved the most complicated for last year, or for almost last. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about fertilization at this point. And this is something that is definitely a little bit more complicated when you're looking at kind of creating a fertility regime, and then figuring out some of the calibration math that's involved with this. Okay, so as many of you probably know, we do have a Maryland fertilizer law, and this is outlined within the MDA publication, How to Fertilize Your Lawn Responsibly. We've had this on the books since 2013, I think. So it's been maybe 2014 it was implemented. So anyway, it's been around for 6 or 7 years, and basically it just kind of codifies best management practices for fertilizer applications here in Maryland. So if you're not familiar with this publication, you can look it up online. There's also hard copies of this at the MDA. But I just want to kind of look at a couple of the high points right now. A lot of our fertilizer recommendations kind of come back to the research that we've done over the years at the University of Maryland. So what this is trying to do is really kind of base that on what we've done, what we've shown to be effective from both a plant growth perspective and an environmental stewardship perspective. So the regulations on this kind of mesh those together. So within this, we're looking, and I know this is a little small for you all, but if you look with me at the second bullet here, a single fertilizer application may not exceed 0.9 pound total nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, and no more than 0.7 pounds that can be soluble nitrogen. So soluble nitrogen is going to be fast release nitrogen that's quickly available to the plant, but it's also has more propensity to leach through the soil profile. So that's we'll talk a little bit more about soluble versus insoluble in the next few slides. Another key point of this is that a lot of our soils in Maryland, except for maybe towards the beach, are adequate in phosphorus. And so what we've seen is a lot more fertilizers available with zero phosphorus. And so by the Maryland fertilizer law, if you you can only add phosphorus if you're doing a new seeding, or if you have a soil test that shows that you have a deficiency in phosphorus. So a lot of times you'll see these products with 0% phosphorus, and that's why you're seeing more and more of those. Kind of common sense here: keep fertilizer applications 10 to 15 feet away from waterways. We certainly don't want to fertilize right up to the water. If you get it down at the right rate and into the grass, it's going to be taken up by the grass, and not moving down towards water. Obviously, if we get nutrients into the water, there's a lot of negative ramifications of that. So we want to do everything that we can do to keep clippings out of surface water, keep fertilizer out of surface water. We also see here that we want to be fertilizing during the growing season. So no fertilization between November 15th and March 1st. So if we think about most of our growing season through the state, it's going to be March to mid-November. So this makes sense. And then regardless of date, do not fertilize when the ground is frozen or when we have a heavy rain predicted. That heavy rain can lead to unintended leaching. As I mentioned before, make sure you're sweeping off fertilizer from sidewalks, driveways, streets, etc. Some people have used over the years fertilizers as de-icers, and that's just not a good practice, because again, that we're losing that fertilizer down the storm drain if it's not swept up. So really, I think this law is pretty good with kind of codifying a lot of our best management practices that we should be doing. And so I know that a lot of you are probably familiar with this, but my sense is that the average homeowner is probably not. So I think from my perspective, being able to, kind of encourage all of you with your public interactions to remind folks of these fertilizer best management practices as you're able to within conversations and educational opportunities is I think is going to benefit everybody. So you all are kind of on the ground talking to a lot of people, and let's get the word out about this, about these fertilizer best management practices. I saw a lot of chat with Stephanie. Was there some questions right now, or?
Yeah, we have a lot of fertilizer
I saw a bunch
questions. Yeah, we can get to some.
I saw a bunch pop up. I didn't see what they were.
Yes. So going back to aeration, just to finish up that section,
Yeah.
we did have someone ask if they can aerate themselves or if they should hire a professional.
So you can actually aerate. You can actually rent an aerifier from an equipment rental store, or sometimes the big box stores have them as well. And those, I got to tell you, a lot of landscapers are probably going to have pretty similar pieces of equipment. It's not until you really get into sports fields, golf courses, that they're going to have the higher end aerifiers. So it just kind of depends on what you're up for. Obviously, if if you hire somebody, I will tell you, from a landscaper perspective, it's a great margin. You're getting people to pay for that. The flip side is that you don't have to deal with transporting that back to your house, etc. The other thing to think about is that if you're up for doing it, and maybe you have a neighbor or two or three who's up for doing it, maybe you split the cost. So whereas it might be $65 for the day, you split it among 4 families, you just paid $17 each. So
idea.
So that's an idea I usually try to get people to think about with their neighbors, and it's it's like you just walk down the street and everybody aerifies.
Awesome. That's a great idea. Is it possible to aerate very sandy soil?
Um, you can, but if it's, I would say that if it's very sandy, the need for aerification is much less, because by the nature of that sand texture, you already have a fair amount of air in that soil. Whereas if you have silty, loamy, clayey soil, it's much easier to compact. So when you go over a sandy soil, um, if it's dry, it's going to be tough to really get in there and pull the cores out. So we definitely want to have it wet or damp at least. And that's actually a good reminder for all soils. If it's really dry, the air fire is just going to bounce along and not go into the soil. So if you can have the soil at least, somewhat damp, that'll help with the effectiveness of the aerification.
Okay. And then is there a particular guidance to the type of aeration they're referencing? We're calling something like a 3 to 4 inch plug.
So the deeper you can get, the better. 3 to 4 inch would be great for a home lawn.
Okay.
Yeah,
Excellent.
and again, if you're able to have the soil at least damp, that'll help the tines go into the soil more effectively.
Okay. And I think that's the last one on aeration, and the next ones were more about fertilization.
Okay.
Okay. What is your opinion of milorganite? Can this be considered near zero phosphorus since it is considered bound phosphorus, and the slow release? Oh, is this slow release of phosphorus and nitrogen better than chemical fertilizers?
So, as per the, a lot of our sewage, that's a processed sewage sludge. So a lot of our organic fertilizers are going to have phosphorus, and so that's kind of a little bit of a quirky thing to deal with in the rule, because a lot of those are slow release too, and so they don't really pose that much risk from an environmental perspective. So to answer that, I'd say that in my mind, milorganite's a great product to use. Good, consistent, slow release product. So technically, if you don't have a phosphorus deficiency, you're not supposed to use phosphorus. So I'll kind of leave that at that. But I do think milorganite's a great product.
Okay. How often should you fertilize?
I'm gonna get into that.
Okay, great. And is it too late to fertilize a zoysia grass lawn now?
So it's perfect time to fertilize zoysia grass. So we'll talk about the fact that cool season grasses you want to do spring and fall, but warm season grasses really they're looking at May to August. So we are perfect time to fertilize zoysia grass now.
Okay, and there were some earlier questions that I think had to do with this. What's the best fertilizer for a 1-year-old zoysia lawn?
We're gonna talk about that a little bit, but in general, we're looking at something with a ratio of about three in the nitrogen to 0 in the phosphorus to 2 or 3 in the potassium. And then looking at slow release, and we're going to talk more about slow release in the next few slides, but really slow release is helpful because it provides a longer lasting feeding than, fast release. You get a quick response for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then it's done. So it gives you more longer lasting feeding with slow release, water insoluble nitrogen products. Again, I've got a few slides on that.
Okay. Are rules for fertilization different for farms versus non-agricultural areas?
Yeah. So certainly, the rules for fertilization?
Yes.
Oh, the state rules?
I think so.
The state rules are the state rules. That said, kind of makes sense if you're out on acreage and not close to surface water and don't have sandy soils, I mean, the environmental risk is much reduced anyway. So my big thing is, the thing is that if you put too much fertilizer down at a given time, even if it doesn't leach, even if it doesn't run into surface water, the plant can only deal with so much at a given time, and you run the risk of actually burning the plant and stressing the plant out to where to where it's a detriment to the plant. So you think about this on this curve. I mean, kind of just like eating. Well, it's good to eat the right amount, but if you eat too much, then that makes you feel bad. So.
Sure. Okay. That makes sense. The rest of the questions that I have are related to kind of troubleshooting and pest management issues.
Okay, and we'll get into that after fertilization. Great.
Excellent.
Okay, so obviously our heavier soils like clay and loam and silt are going to have better capacity for holding nutrients. With a higher cation exchange capacity, if you remember that from your soils module. So our sandier soils don't hold nutrients as well. So if you're in a sandy soil, you usually recommend folks fertilize a little bit less, but more often, so that you're not, putting the rate that you would put down on heavier soils. Typically, as lawns age, there's a better system where these nutrients are recycled. And so typically older lawns won't need as much fertilizer as newer lawns. So we're talking, 10, 15, 20-year lawns typically don't need as much. Now, if you've got a lawn that's never been fertilized, and you've got, you've got a lot of weeds in there, that's part of the reason is you have those weeds is because you haven't had the fertility to kind of keep the grass going. But, if you've been fertilizing correctly, typically 15, 20 year and older lawns don't need as much fertility. Length of growing season is going to affect how much we fertilize. So, obviously with, we've got a longer growing season down at the beach than we do up in Garrett County and Allegheny County. If we have a lot of traffic, creates a lot of stress on the plants. So you're gonna want to be at the high end of the fertilization recommendations. If you have shade, you're going to be towards the lower medium end of the recommendations in a shady situation. So we talked about the fact that clippings are going to be able to positively influence the amount of fertilizer or nutrients that are returned back to the plant. We also consider micronutrients. So typically in our heavier soils, loamier soils, our micronutrients are going to be adequate. We can prove that via soil test. But if we get down to the beach in our sandier soils, sometimes our micronutrients are lacking. And so in that case, we're going out and we're finding a specialty product where we can add those micronutrients back in. And then another important factor to consider with fertilization is the application equipment. So obviously when we apply, we want to try to be as consistent as we can and have a spreader that is applying consistently, and we're moving in a pattern that allows for consistent application over a given area. So I know that all of you probably talked about this more in your soils training, but really looking at trying to soil test at least every 3 years for nutrient needs. And these soil tests are going to be able to show the major and minor nutrients, pH, organic matter content. Organic matter content is important because it kind of provides a proxy of soil health. It's not a straight correlation, but it's a loose correlation there, and gives an indication of the carbon in the soil and the soil health of that particular area. And so the test will usually provide nutrient and lime recommendations. Again, the big thing in our area if you're applying phosphorus, you're supposed to have a soil test that shows that your soil is deficient in phosphorus. So if we look at pH, a lot of times if our pH is below 5.5-ish, you'll see lime recommendations on that soil test as well. A lot of our turfgrass plants grow optimally in the 5.5 to 6.5 slightly acidic pH range. And a large part of that is because most of the nutrients that are needed are most available in that range. Most, maybe not all, but most of them are best available in that range. So when you're going out to take a soil test, obviously you want to try to take different soil tests for different areas that are representative of your lawn, and you want to try to go out, do this in a relatively randomized pattern, and then be able to take subsamples, 10 to 12 subsamples, and then bulk them, mix them in a bucket, bulk them together for a composite sample for that given area. Now, if you got a vegetable bed, you're managing that a lot different than you are lawn. So you'll want to separate out your soil tests for different areas within your landscape. As mentioned, cool season grasses. The reason I put this up here again is we're really going to focus on looking at this fall fertilization, where our shoot growth is less than it was in the spring, and our root growth, we're really trying to, as the plant gets ready for winter, it's really pushing the roots. You've still got soil temperatures that are relatively warm. You've got air temperatures that are cooling off. You've got a physiological condition where the plant is sending its carbohydrates down to the roots for winter survival. And so really the fall is the best time to try to advocate for root growth. If we fertilize in the spring, we're advocating a little bit more for shoot growth. And then for warm season grasses, so this would be a zoysia grass, I would say, being able to fertilize anytime between the time it really gets growing, May 1st-ish through about Labor Day or so is going to be our time to fertilize zoysia grass. So when we think about the numbers on the bag, I've alluded to this a little bit earlier, and I think most of you probably know this having gone through the Master Gardener's training. But we look at nitrogen being the first number, and that's kind of for our top growth, phosphorus for root growth. As mentioned, a lot of our soils are already sufficient in phosphorus. So nitrogen is going to be, especially for top growth in the spring, less so, more for a little bit more for tiller growth and for root growth in the fall time, and then potassium for overall stress tolerance. So we think about a lot of our winterizer fertilizers will have equal amounts of N and K as the plant is ready to go under a stress for the winter time. But if we can really keep this, and I don't have the ratio on here, but if we can really keep this in about a 3 to 0 to 2 ratio for those numbers on the fertilizer analysis, that's pretty much where we want to be, and that's kind of reflective of the percentage of nutrients, or the ratio of the percentage of nutrients that are within the turfgrass leaf in a healthy stand. So again, want to be about 3 to 0 to 2 here. Our secondary elements are usually sufficient. Again, you might run into issues with these in sandy soils, but our secondary elements are going to be things like sulfur, calcium, and magnesium. I will note that you have two different limes that are typically used. So if you've got a low pH and you're looking at liming, we've got our agricultural lime, typically going to be calcium carbonate. And then if we have our dolomitic lime, that's going to have both calcium and magnesium in it. So if I'm in a situation where I need a lime and I have a magnesium deficiency, I'm looking more at dolomitic lime as opposed to straight up agricultural line. Our micronutrients, of course, are needed in small amounts, but they're still needed. And sometimes we can run into micronutrient deficiencies and sandier soils. And again, you can find this out via a soil test, and soil test will be able to give recommendations. Practically speaking, it's difficult to just go out and buy one micronutrient. Usually you're going to buy a micronutrient package that where you have a number of different micronutrients within a given product. So our micronutrients are going to include things like boron, iron. Probably iron is going to be the most important of these micronutrients. Of course, iron is an important component of the chlorophyll molecule. Manganese is as well, and then we also look at things like zinc and copper. Speaking of iron, one thing that you see some of the pros do to get a little bit greener color in the summertime is actually go out and you can find liquid forms of chelated iron. There's also granular forms, but the liquid's going to give you better coverage. So if you're in a situation where, okay, we've gotten to summertime, you're not really supposed to fertilize cool season grass, but you want a little bit of enhanced color, being able to apply iron is one way to do that without adding the major nutrients that are going to incur growth during a time that we don't want to incur more growth. Or we have a risk of burning because of those other, nitrogen-based fertilizers. So little trick of the pros there, spraying on iron will help to enhance color without stimulating growth. So if you recall, when I went through the fertilizer regulations, I noted that you're allowed to apply 0.9 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, of which only 0.7 pounds could be water soluble or fast release. Really, with my personal recommendations, I try to encourage folks to find slow release fertilizers. And this, I would define this as anything that has more than 50% of nitrogen available as slow release, or you'll see this term water insoluble on the back of the bag. So if we think about insoluble, it doesn't break down as water as quickly, and so it's going to be available for a longer period of time. It also has a lower salt index, so all of our fertilizers are going to have a certain amount of salt to them, as they are chemically salts. So some of our water-soluble products have a higher salt index. If we put that on during the heat of summer, you can actually cause an osmotic shift where you see this fertilizer burn, basically this intense drought stress, because you've altered the salt balance within the rhizosphere there. So that's one of the reasons we don't really fertilize much in the summertime, is because of that. Between the heat and the salt, it does more harm than good for most cool season grasses. I mentioned before avoiding phosphorus if the soil test indicates phosphorus is adequate. If possible, try to water in the fertilizer to move it off the leaf blade into the soil. This is less of an issue if you have a water insoluble product. And if you have a water soluble product that has a high salt index, it's really important to move that off the leaf blade so that you don't burn the leaf blade. Now, that said, you don't want to fertilize before there's an inch of rain via thunderstorms forecast. A perfect time to fertilize would be when you maybe have showers in the forecast in the next few hours. Nothing too intense, but just kind of light to moderate showers. And then again, it's probably the third time I've said it, but make sure you sweep fertilizer off hard surfaces. So let's look at fertilizer programs. For tall fescue, we're looking at, again, our 0.9 pounds of N per 1,000 square feet in September and October for sure, and then usually one more time in May or early June. Try to get people to time this before it gets hot. So again, if we're fertilizing in late March, April, what we have is that we have this flush of growth as things are warming up. Soil temps are a little behind air temps, but things are warming up, and you have this flush of growth. So fertilizing more is just going to stimulate more shoot growth. If we're able to fertilize when some of that shoot growth is slowed down after the initial flush, temperatures are warming up. Because of that, growth pattern is slowing down a little bit. But we want to try to give it a little bit of fertilizer to get through the summer. This period in May and early June, before it really gets earnestly hot, you can go out and do that in the springtime. But if you fertilize in April, I think you're just adding to more clippings, which are tough to keep up with anyway. For fine fescue, maybe about a half. The other thing is you can go with a half a pound in May or early June with tall fescue. And the reason that I would, although most of our fertilization is emphasized in the fall, the reason that I might fertilize in the spring is if I have a thin stand and I'm trying to create density, trying to get it to fill in, or it's worn out, I'm trying to get it to fill in. Doing that in the spring will kind of help that. Fine fescue, just a half pound in spring, 0.9 pound once in the fall. And again, our standard expression of this is pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per application. And again, we want to emphasize fall fertilization. For zoysia grass, I've seen several zoysia grass lawns around where they get fertilized 0 or 1 time a year. If you can fertilize in June, then fertilize again a month later or 2 months later in August. I think that's great for trying to get 1.8 pounds out on zoysia grass. So this is a screenshot from that same publication I showed at the beginning of the fertilizer section. And I love this chart done by the MDA because it indicates the real season for fertilization. So I think a lot of homeowners get into March and April and they're at, these garden centers and they're hearing everything on the radio and thinking, oh, I got to go out and fertilize. Let me go out. Garden season's getting going. I got to go out and fertilize. Well, if you haven't fertilized in fall, you haven't set yourself up for a good season. And so I would, again, not to say that I wouldn't fertilize in spring, but it would be a half rate at 0.5 or just once in spring towards the end of spring. But really your season, your fertilization season, that's why I love this chart. Fertilization season starts in September. So here you are, 1 application in September, 1 application in October, late May, early June if needed for tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass. This brings you up to 2.7, which is your annual yearly allowed amount as per the MDA on lawns. Fine fescue, again, doesn't need as much fertilizer. Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, both warm season grasses with a, relatively, short growing season if we're looking at 5 months. This is a great little chart from that particular publication. And I particularly like it because as a professional, I think of fertilizing in the fall and setting up for next year. I don't think of playing catch up in the spring like a lot of homeowners do. Okay, so let's look at how you read the label. So I've taken a example label here. We've got this ringer safer lawn restore here. So we've got, if we look at the numbers on the front of the bag, and they're required to have these numbers on the front of the bag, 1006, and then you kind of flip the bag over. We'll look and see on the label more details about the content of this particular product. So we see with the total nitrogen, they've actually broken it down for us as required by law. So they've got 1.9% nitrate nitrogen, 0.5% other water-soluble nitrogen. And so nitrate nitrogen is a fast-release source, is a water-soluble source. And then water-insoluble nitrogen is 7.6%. So if we think about kind of my general guideline of, I want to find a fertilizer that's at least 50% slow release, this one fits the bill, since we have about 3/4 of it, 7.6 of the 10% is going to be slowly released or water insoluble nitrogen. We know we have no phosphorus since we have a 0 in the second number there, and then the potash or potassium is going to be 6% as indicated on the front of the bag. And then it talks about what it's derived from. This happens to be an organic product, so it's derived from poultry feather meal, nitrate of soda, but a lot of times it will give you information about from what the product is derived. So really, I guess the bottom line with this particular slide is, don't just get, don't just look at the front of the bag. Flip the bag over, look at the label to see what the breakout of fast release nitrogen, and typically if it's fast release, it'll be listed as nitrate or ammoniacal. And if it's slow release, it'll be listed as water insoluble, or sometimes you'll see slowly available nitrogen. Stephanie, I saw a couple questions. Are they, would now be a good time to address those?
Yeah, we've got a lot. So we did talk about how often you should fertilize depending on the different types of species that they have. So I think we should be covered there. The next question is, what are your thoughts on applying seed and only practicing aerification? So I guess instead of also adding fertilizer.
My thoughts are that you're going to eventually have off-type grasses and broadleaf weeds come into your system.
Okay.
And if you're okay with that, I mean, I'm not the lawn police, but just realize that that the fertility program is going to affect the species composition.
Okay. What is the best recommendation to fertilize a lawn mixed with zoysia grass and tall fescue?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. Kind of funny because at the Arboretum, I actually have a lawn where I put down zoysia grass and then I overseeded tall fescue. So it's kind of nice where the zoysia grass will go off color, and then I've got the tall fescue right there. But I assume that question kind of refers to, you've got a clump of zoysia, you've got a clump of tall fescue. So, I would generally fertilize based on the tall fescue in that situation, unless I've got an area where a situation where I'm really trying to favor the zoysia grass, then I don't fertilize, but maybe once in the summer. So a lot of what I've seen have been, okay, I've got clumps of zoysia grass, and most of it's tall fescue. So I would kind of fertilize based upon the tall fescue schedule in that situation.
Okay, got it. For timing to fertilize, if a lawn is dense and healthy, should the spring fertilizer step be skipped?
Yeah, I would consider it. Like I said, I fertilizing in spring. If I've got a situation where I'm thin, where it's weak, then I go with the spring fertilization. If I'm in really good shape in the spring, I skip it and fertilize September, October.
Okay. What do you think about weed and feed fertilizers?
In general, I'm not a big fan of them. So there's a couple different product categories. There's a weed and feed I think that most people are probably most familiar with, which is it contains a pre-emergent and a fertilizer. So a lot of these combination products, if you look at the nitrogen, if you look at the fertilizer, it's going to be almost all fast release fertilizer, which I just kind of explained that I don't really agree with. I see, from a marketing perspective, they say, oh, look, you can do 2 steps at once. But the time that we are supposed to put down pre-emergent, which is typically forsythia, half gold, half green, or mostly gold, somewhere in that neighborhood, is really not a great time to put down fertilizer in my mind. So I tend to try to separate those out.
That makes sense. Yeah, excellent.
There's another category where they have weed and feed to get rid of dandelions and broadleaf weeds. And for that, again, it's fast release nitrogen, but you're putting out, if you've only got a couple areas of weeds, you're actually putting out herbicide over the whole area, where you don't need that herbicide over the whole area. And then you've got to get that fertilizer to stick to the leaf to kill the weed, but then it's got to go down to the soil to feed the plant. So again, if it's a weed and feed in that situation, I don't like that either.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'd rather just spot spray or hand pick if you can, weeds.
Okay. How do you time fertilizing, overseeding, and aerating? What is the order, and can you do them all in 1 year?
You can do them all in one day. In fact, that's what I kind of would recommend if you've got time to do that in September. So what I would do is I would go out, I would aerate first. I would fertilize second, and then I would seed third.
Got it.
Although you could argue seeding second and fertilizing third. You could argue that either way, but I would definitely aerify first because that provides a little nook for the seeds to fall into.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can you please repeat the name for water insoluble nitrogen?
So sometimes that's referred to as slowly available nitrogen.
Okay. I think that's what they meant.
Okay, yeah. So again, chemistry wise, if something is insoluble, it doesn't break down in water very easily, and that's what we want. We want it to break down in water slowly.
Okay. Okay, after you put fertilizer on the lawn, how long should you wait to cut it?
Day. I'd give it a day space. Or if you cut it and then fertilize.
Okay.
If you fertilize and then cut it, I give it a day, at least a day, if not 2 days of space.
Sure.
But the flip side of that is you can cut it and then fertilize, and then you've given it 7 or 10 days of space.
Okay. And what pre-emergent do you recommend?
I'm going to talk about that in the last hour. We do have till noon, right, Stephanie?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Yep. I'm going to talk about that in the last hour.
Okay. Will overseeding decrease weeds?
In general, it doesn't happen overnight. But in general, if you look at the mid and long-term dynamics of the ecology, what is our best defense against weeds in its density?
Got it.
So being able to fertilize judiciously to encourage the grass plant, being able to overseed to fill in thin or bare areas, both of those two things are going to be our best defense against weed encroachment.
Okay. And would it be better to have several types of grasses in your lawn, like cool and warm season or other mixes?
So the concept of mixing a cool and a warm season grass doesn't happen often in home lawns. Um, Again, we've got an area of it down at the Arboretum because we're trying to think outside the box.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of get the best of both worlds. Again, we put zoysia down first, and then we overseeded with tall fescue. And I think it's a great mix because you have the best of both worlds. So I try to take care of the zoysia in the summer and I take care of the tall fescue in the spring and the fall. If you're going with a straight up cool season, usually you don't mix warm season grasses because they will segregate out and it will look odd. So usually you don't mix warm season grasses on purpose. But for cool season grasses, like I said earlier, sometimes you'll throw in 10-15% of Kentucky bluegrass into a tall fescue stand. And the hope is that you get a little bit of that creeping with the rhizomes. Also, a lot of our more high quality turf type tall fescue mixes will have at least 3 different varieties. And so you're getting 3 different genetic capabilities. You might have one variety that's a little bit better color. You might have one variety that's a little bit better drought tolerance. You might have one variety that's a little bit better disease tolerance. So certainly being able to combine those attributes is a good thing. And a lot of times tall fescue is going to be sold in a blend like that.
Mm-hmm.
Especially the higher quality high quality seed products from professionals or from reputable locally owned garden centers.
Got it. Okay. And how do you aerate when you have large tree roots?
Very carefully. No, it's tough. There's no easy answer for that. It's you got to kind of, because you don't want to beat up your machine and then have to pay a damage fee to the rental place.
Sure.
I would just say, if you avoid them
Okay.
if you can. I know that the horticulture, the arborist folks have, if you want to aerify around a tree and aerify for a tree, there's something called a tree spade where you can get in there. It's like a spade and it kind of injects this air. But that's more of it's kind of crossing into arboriculture. So I definitely try to avoid tree roots.
Okay.
Or the other thing you can do is actually, for little areas, you can actually get little hand air fires that, it's kind of 2 prongs there and you just kind of poke them in, and you're doing it by hand.
Okay.
So that's an option too.
Great. Okay. Is fine fescue best for a shady lawn, and does a shady lawn require more fertilizer?
Shady lawns should have less fertilizer because you have less photosynthetic capabilities with the reduced sunlight. So fine fescues are best adapted for shady lawns. That said, they can tolerate light to moderate shade. If you're getting into deep shade, then a lot of times I would recommend people go with another ground cover. So, something like, Allegheny foam flower is great. The native Pachysandra, I know a lot of people have Japanese Pachysandra, but if you can find the native Pachysandra, that does well. The other thing we think about is sedges. So something like Carex pennsylvanica, Pennsylvania sedge, has a grass-like appearance, but it has a lot more shade tolerance.
Yeah.
So, and I know I'm not going to go, I'm not kind of, I don't have slides on lawn alternatives per se, but
Sure.
if you got too much shade and you've just been fighting it, just go with another ground cover. And, the Home and Garden Information Center through our extension website has a whole page on ground covers.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
a lot of suggestions for lawn alternatives on there.
And I think what happens is, you buy a house and, 15 or 20 years go by and where you used to have lawn around a tree. Now that tree is 20 years bigger, and you just don't, you have too many roots and too much shade, and it's just time to kind of transition that space to another plant.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, then I think the last one for here, the rest are more kind of like problems, and so we'll wait to get
And
to
we'll get,
this.
and that's very end. I wanted to try to include some kind of troubleshooting,
Yeah,
what to ask
perfect.
when you're at the farmer's market at the table, and what to ask a client,
Perfect. So then the last one before that section is does the presence of moss mean anything other than acidic soil? And can you lime based on moss presence without testing for pH?
So moss, there's actually 4 conditions that moss likes. Moss likes acidic soil. Moss likes low fertility. Moss likes shade, and moss likes damp conditions.
Okay.
So just because you have moss, you have to kind of think, or sometimes you have a combination thereof, So just because you have moss doesn't automatically mean that you have a low pH. You kind of gotta analyze some other things going on. Does it have any of those other factors?
Okay.
So again, I could say those again. I don't know if people are writing this down, but
I've been taking notes.
low pH, shade, under fertilized or never fertilized, and then damp or wet conditions. Maybe not soaking wet, but damp.
Mhm. Okay.
And
All
then
right.
to remove moss, actually, I know there's products you can spray and all this stuff, but we got to remember moss is not a vascular plant. So whatever you're basically you just burning off the top. Whatever product you spray, whether it's iron or whether that's like an iron sulfate or ammoniated soaps of fatty acids, you're just burning off the top.
Mhm.
So in effect, you need to get in there with a hard rake or a dethatcher or something and actually physically remove that. Now it might be easier to do it after it's had iron sulfate applied. It's going to be a little bit weaker. It's going to be a little bit easier to do that. But really, you can't just spray something and say, oh, well, the moss is going to be gone in 2 weeks.
Mhm.
It's not, because there's another layer underneath.
Right.
So just important for folks to remember.
Yeah, that is an important point.
And then fix those underlying problems, whatever they may be.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm just checking over my list here. Yep, everything else is kind of fungus, violets, troubleshooting. So we'll get into those next.
Okay, great. Yeah, yep. And after I get it through weeds, I'm going to go into some IPM considerations as well. So let's just get through fertilizer, and I'll talk a little bit about IPM. So we are now back to figuring out how much fertilizer we need for a given area. So we know the analysis. This happens to be 1006 for our safer organic example we had a slide or two ago. So the first step we want to do is calculate how much product is needed for 1,000 square feet. So remember that's product, not just nitrogen, but the actual product. We know that the product, for every pound that we hold, we've got 0.1 pound of actual nitrogen. The other thing I think that is helpful for folks is to fertilize in 2 different directions at half rate if possible. That way, if you make a mistake, it's only half a mistake, if you will. So, for example, here we've got 0.9 pounds of N using a 1006. Let's say we have a 2,000 square foot lawn. So the way that we would do that is that we would divide the intended rate by the analysis. I should say target or intended rate by the analysis. And so if we divide 0.9 by 10%, 0.9 divided by 0.1 equals 9 pounds of actual product to achieve 0.9 pounds of N per 1,000 square feet. So then if we know that we have 2,000s with our 2,000 square foot lawn. So we take this times 2 and we find that we have 18 pounds of product will be needed for 2,000 square feet. Now remember, this is based on this product. If you had a 2006, you would divide this 0.9 by 20%. So you would have half of that. You'd have 4.5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. So you need to be able to do the math based upon the product that you have and the analysis that you have. In addition to Turf ID, I feel like this is another stretch of the presentation where I really wish we could be in person. Stephanie, I think I talked to you about this, but Courtney Coddington and I Courtney Coddington, of course, the Master Gardener coordinator up in Carroll County, we tentatively have a fertilization workshop. And I know it's the first week in September, which is right before fertilization season. So I know that we need to coordinate, and certainly I'm happy to either go to other counties to do that hands-on workshop or invite people to Courtney's. Again, depending on public health status, that, you know, obviously everything is contingent on that.
Absolutely.
But I do want to try to remind folks about that.
Great. Yeah, we'll make sure we send the link to register. If it's going to happen in person or when it happens, we'll send the link to everybody so they can register to attend.
Okay. So with fertilizer application, we got two main types of spreaders. We got the rotary spreader here, and we got the drop spreader. I know they're also little hand, I don't have a picture of it, but little hand spreaders for really small areas. But thing to remember with this rotary spreader is that you've got a tapered pattern here. So you're applying more product in the middle than you are at the edges of your throw. And because of that, you'll want to throw what they call wheel to wheel. So your subsequent pass will be at the very edge of your previous pass, basically where your wheels were, and then you'll be throwing the edge of your subsequent pass back to the middle of your previous pass. So being able to do that, you're able to have an even coverage. So based upon your spreader setting and your spreader and your walking speed, it's important to try to figure out, okay, how wide is the spreader applying? And then whatever that width is, make sure that you're being consistent throughout the lawn to throw back to that wheel to wheel. That said, it's also incredibly important to be consistent with your walking speed. So if you start out particularly fast and then you are particularly slow, you're going to get different coverage over that time. For drop spreaders, these are just dropping right where the hopper is. So just inside the wheels here. And of course, you're going to have to overlap the wheels by just a little bit to make sure that you don't have any skips in between. So when we're fertilizing, I really encourage you to be careful, to kind of plan out your route, plan out, be cognizant of obstacles, be cognizant of curves that you need to be aware of, etc. So in this situation, now I got this picture off the internet. It looks like they had a drop spreader, and apparently they probably crossed one wheel right on top of the other wheel instead of a little bit of crossover. It also looks like a fast release product was used. So you have these skips here. Then they got to this curve and kind of thought, oh, gee whiz, what do I do with this curve? How do I deal with that? And so you have a very inconsistent application here. What I would encourage is if you've got an odd shape like this, that's up against a driveway or other hard surface, I would encourage you to do kind of a cleanup lap around. Now, with a rotary spreader, you want to make sure that you're not spreading fertilizer into the street. So you kind of got to be careful with that. Maybe you do go a little bit slower so that rotary spreader isn't spreading fertilizer as widely. And then you want to kind of stop before you get to that area where you applied, and then go back and forth, stopping and starting outside of that cleanup area. The other thing that I used to do when I did professional landscaping was, for really sensitive areas like this where you're right near the street, I might do a little bit of just spreading fertilizer by hand, just gently, to make sure that I had good coverage and that I could specifically apply it so that it wasn't in the street. And so I kind of figured out that, I could spend as much time, I spent less time applying by hand. And this takes a little bit of practice to get the rate consistent, but to apply carefully by hand, I spent less time than I would, then going and trying to clean up fertilizer from the street. Just a couple tips there. Now, if you've got a curve around a mulch bed, probably not a big deal to throw fertilizer into your mulch bed. I'm just really concerned with sidewalks, driveways, roads, etc. This particular photo was taken, I took when I used to live in Tacoma, Washington, and I drove by here, thought, it looks like a fertilizer mistake, but you know what? I feel bad just taking a picture of somebody's house without asking them. So I went up and knocked on the door, and at the time I was doing a program for the county that I did environmental lawn care education for homeowners. So they answered, and I kind of told them what I did, and said that I just wanted to kind of take this as an example of what not to do. I asked them what happened. They said, well, I was fertilizing and I kind of forgot where I was, and then I left the fertilizer hopper open, and then I kind of got talking to the neighbor, and then I walked forward a little bit, and then I forgot that the fertilizer hopper was open, so a bunch of it spilled out, and then I guess I didn't keep track of where I was with my pattern. So I said, well, I appreciate that. Is there any way, do you mind me taking a picture of this just for educational purposes? And they said, yeah, that's okay, but just don't show the house. So I guess the big thing here is just be careful. Okay, I'm going to move into IPM here and look at how we use that for lawn care. Actually, Stephanie, is there any more questions on fertilizer before I move on?
No, we don't have any more.
Okay.
Oh, wait, there's one that just came in. Hold on.
Okay.
Is there a specific method to use in adding compost to an established lawn if the lawn is doing well, fairly dense? Is there an advantage to adding compost?
So I believe that in general, there's practically always an advantage to adding compost. The difficult thing that we deal with on the state reg side is that if you add compost, that's probably going to be more, and I know it's all slow release nitrogen, but that's probably going to be more nitrogen than what is allowed by the state regulations.
Got it.
So, however you want to take that.
Got it. Okay. And that's the only other
But
one.
compost has a lot of great properties to use as a soil amendment.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, you can't, if you're establishing a new area, the state regs say you can incorporate that as long as it's incorporated at 10 or 15% into the soil. So we're still kind of working with the MDA on top dressing.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, so let's move on into IPM.
Sorry, we just had one more come in.
Yeah, no problem.
Would the addition of too much nitrogen harm the lawn?
So again, you get a situation where all these fertilizers have some degree of salt to them. Fast release fertilizers are going to have more, slow release fertilizers less. So there's a couple different ways you can harm the lawn with fertilization. So if you put too much of a fast release, high salt fertilizer on there, you're basically going to cause like an osmotic imbalance where the roots experience what they would similarly experience with drought stress. So you're going to see like drought stress type symptoms. The other thing too is that if you overstimulate growth, especially in the late spring, and it's getting hotter and more humid, there's more fungi that will that like to invade more newer, weaker, succulent growth. So you're a little bit more, if you're over fertilizing, you're a little bit more prone to things like brown patch disease. And then the other thing too is that, with this really succulent growth, you're going to have a weaker plant overall, just because it's all this new growth. So you're going to have less stress tolerance. So with the fertilizer, there's a certain amount that's good, and then too much is not good.
Okay, great. And there's a clarification that question referred to too much nitrogen in compost, but I think that could kind of cover too much nitrogen in general, no matter what source you're.
Yeah. So the whole compost thing, and again, we're dealing with the state regs. General rule on top dressing compost is half an inch. Not half an inch, but half an inch. So realize that compost, that compost is made from previously living plant material or previously, previous animal products, etc. And it's got a lot of nitrogen. It's slow release, but it does have a lot. So so you can cause damage. The other thing too is that if you add too much, you're kind of smothered in the grass, and some people think you can get in this layering problem. So a little bit's great, too much is not good.
Okay, got it. All right, that was all. Keep going.
Okay, so we'll talk about the integrated pest management process, and of course, I think a lot of you all are familiar with this in regards to other facets of gardening and horticulture. So our biggest thing is trying to prevent problems, prevent pests with good yard care practices. So this kind of harkens back to all these maintenance practices that I've been talking about over the last 2 hours plus. Another key is, really be able to identify the pest in the life cycle. So we don't have that many turfgrass insect pests, but obviously if you got pests in the landscape, there's all sorts of different species you can have there, but knowing how to approach them is contingent on you being able to identify that pest, know that pest life cycle, know when that pest is susceptible to a treatment, and hopefully that treatment's going to be a less toxic approach. And then the other thing too is to be able to set our pest tolerance threshold. The odds of you getting an absolute weed-free yard are slim. And if you've got good density and you've got a couple weeds, do you really even see the weeds? So that's something to think about. Being able to monitor pests, being able to, with the weather conditions and based on life cycle. And then we're trying to use physical or biological pest controls as kind of our first line of actionable, actionable control. And then lastly, we're looking at, as a last resort, chemical, traditional based pest control. So all of this kind of illustrates this process. So let's think about how that relates to lawns. And I know that a lot of you have probably attended IPM lectures on landscape and other plants. But for lawns, let's look at how this relates. So our host tolerance, our resistance. Thought I had. Oh, you know what? If I may, let me talk about this real quick. This is slightly out of order. I wanted to have this before the previous slide. But another way to think about this is with the IPM pyramid. So our wide base here is cultural practices. Second on the pyramid is going to be our physical and mechanical control, and then biological controls if possible. It's going to be, we don't have too many biological controls in turf. This is more for landscape and agronomic crops. And then our last part here is looking at the chemical, where's my arrow? Looking at the chemical control once we've exhausted all of these approaches. And the first half of this really is looking at biorationals. So, I took this credit Penn State extension for this particular diagram. Not all of these are going to be, this is more geared towards landscape, but this concept of biorational is still valid, that we want to try to we're using chemical controls. We want them to be less toxic, lower, reduced risk, and biorational products. And then our last approach would be conventional products. So let me go back. And this is how it looks, some examples of how this might look in the turf world. So, really looking at our host tolerance and resistance, which is tied in with our cultural controls. So again, there's a saying in landscape design, right plant, right place. If we get the right grass in the right place, that's going to be helpful. So we're looking at fertilizing correctly, watering correctly, mowing correctly, aerating on a regular basis. All of these things are going to help with turfgrass plant health care. Sanitation, this might be a little bit more relatable in the landscape realm. Classic example is I've got apple scab, and that fungus is on the leaves, and then the leaves fall, and then the leaves are on the leaf litter, and then fungus survives in the leaf litter, and then it reinfects the apple plant later. For us, it's more, washing that mower after every use. Trying to make sure that you don't have fungi kind of building up in there. You're able to get a good clip on the lawn. We've got a couple biologicals. I'll talk a little bit about milky spore for grubs, and unfortunately it's been a little bit inconsistent, but we have some research going on that's looking at more biologicals for turfgrass use. Mechanical controls, a great example would be hand picking weeds. And then chemical controls, as I mentioned, try to select less toxic products and biorationals first before relying on conventionals. So I think that a lot of homeowners, are looking for this magic bullet. Oh, I got this. What do I spray? I got that. What do I spray? Well, you gotta, I think it's incumbent upon us as educators to kind of walk them through this IPM process. And it's tough to do because it's not something that you can put in a soundbite. I mean, it takes time to try to explain to people and walk them through it. So it's a challenge. Just a little bit on pesticides. Obviously, we want to be able to identify the pest, choose the correct product, or read the label, wear appropriate protective clothing. And I think you all have another module on product application, so I'm not going to get too far into that. We're going to talk about weeds first, and there's a couple good, really good weed identification sites. Virginia Tech has a great site, and then Michigan State as well. I think they've done, not to disparage our site, but these sites have done particularly well with turfgrass weeds. So these are great resources for that. When we think about our weed growth habit, couple different ways that weeds grow. So you think about our rosettes. These would be examples, would be dandelion, carrot, plantain. We could think about creeping growth habits. So this would be things like clover, ground ivy, and these are going to be, these creepers are going to have either stolons or rhizomes, and a lot of times our tough to control weeds are going to be these creepers because it's really tough to kind of eradicate the entire weed. These rosettes, fairly easy to handpick if we've got the right type of weed digging tool because they're not spreading out. We go down to the taproot, we get it, and that's, we've got it. Another way to looking at these life cycles and biology of weeds, of course, perennials are going to live over multiple years. We also have annuals that are going to complete their life cycle in 1 year or less. Probably the most familiar lawn weed annual that people know is crabgrass, which happens to be a summer annual. So it's going to germinate with warmer weather in the spring, and it's going to die with the first frost. And then biennials, we don't have too many of these in turf, but a biennial plant is one that has vegetative growth in the first year and then will produce a flower for reproduction in the second year. So I'm going to breeze through this. Again, I'll make this available to everyone via PDF. But we've got perennials, summer annual grasses, summer annual broadleaves. We've got a few of those. We've also got winter annual grasses and then winter annual broadleaves. So different ways of looking at classifying weed life cycles and their biologies. That happens to be a repeat of the previous slide. Sorry about that. But the one thing I want to say about our approach to this for weeds is that a lot of times weeds are going to be symptoms of cultural problems. So just like that moss example, we've got moss there because it's more competitive than the grass. Whatever that case, one of those four factors, combination of those four factors, so whatever we can do to make that grass more competitive is going to be our first line of defense. And really, when you're looking at problem solving, you're kind of thinking, okay, well, why are the weeds there? And are there deficiencies in my cultural management program for my turf grass that can be addressed? Because if those aren't going to be addressed, sure, you could probably find something, you can hand pick it out, you could spray something, get rid of it. But if you're not addressing the underlying cultural problems, then you're going to continue to have that weed pressure. As mentioned before, I encourage you to establish tolerance levels. If you've got a dense grass, you really don't notice a couple weeds as much. So, really consider, consider the product that you're using. Always follow label directions. With traditionals, I especially encourage you to try to just spot spray as opposed to blanket spray. If you've got weeds only in one area, just spray in that area. We talked about the fact that I'm not a big fan of weed and feeding. I think you really got to, instead of blanket weed and feeding for a broadleaf, I think spot spraying is going to be the better way to go. With pre-emergence, obviously, if you're putting out a pre-emergent, you want it to go over the whole lawn. But the fact that you've got a fast-release nitrogen in there, I try to separate out that weeding and feeding. And, when we think about density, being able to overseed with a seed-soil mix, maybe you get some seed, mix up a little soil in a bucket, and then you kind of sprinkle it into areas that are weak, that are thin. There's a lot that can be said for that. So being able to do that on a consistent basis, I think, is very helpful over the years. Stephanie asked me to give you all a quiz at the end, so I'm going to ask you to look at the slide for a minute or two, and then this is what the quiz will be based on. Just wanted to show that a lot of time weeds can be indicators of conditions. So Purdue's got a great website on this. Here's a list. So we got acid soils, compacted soils, dry soils. A lot of times, not always, but certain weeds just kind of favor certain conditions. So this is when you're looking at problem solving and underlying conditions, a lot of times this can be useful. So there's a lot of several universities that have these kind of charts. That was Purdue's. This is Illinois'. There's been a lot of research on this, and these lists are relatively readily available from land grant universities. Although I don't know that we have one that's readily available, but Purdue and Illinois do a good job of this. If you're really into weed ID, this is a publication done by Purdue, and really it's kind of a conglomeration of weeds that we find both in the Midwest, Northeast, Mid-Atlantic. Just a really good resource. At Maryland, we have not had the research personnel, research and extension personnel that some of these other schools have had multiple turfgrass personnel. So I kind of defer to some of these publications as opposed to ours at Maryland. We don't have a publication that is this well done like Purdue has done. Let's see. So mechanical weed control, I think this is a viable option if you've got a relatively small population of weeds and non-creeping weeds. So you've got dandelions, you've got plantains, and you're able to catch them before the population really explodes. So, just going out in the evening, you've got a couple weeds, go out, with your weeding tool, have a little glass of wine, little beer, go out and do a little bit of weeding. So obviously if you've got a lot of weeds, this becomes a lot more intensive. Also other mechanical ways of doing this include raking or dethatching if you got weak rooted annuals. So if you're, for instance, you're trying to do some overseeding in September, you've got crabgrass. Now crabgrass is going to be bigger that time of year, but if you go over with a thatcher, a lot of times you can beat that crabgrass up and then create a good seed bed for being able to kind of overseed into that. So just kind of depending. Obviously, our annuals are going to be not have as extensive roots as perennials would. So you've got the weed hound here, kind of fun. You push this down, it kind of pinches around the weed and you pull it up. Of course, screwdriver works well for picking out weeds. And then if you want to get into a lot of fun, you can get into the flame weeder. So this is obviously going to be a little bit more effective in gravel beds, sidewalks, probably not in the lawn situation. You probably want to try to avoid this in mulch beds if it's especially hot outside, so you don't catch the mulch on fire. Okay, so moving into some of our herbicide products. Couple different ways that we can kind of categorize these would be pre-emergent. So these would be applied prior to the weed seed germinating. Classic example would be crabgrass control. You also have post-emergence. So this would be where the weed already is present. And then you also have another way of categorizing herbicides would be non-selective. So these would be products like polygonic acid, which is in scythe, which is kind of a biorational alternative to Roundup. And then selective, where you have products that are selectively controlling broadleaf weeds, products that are selectively controlling grassy weeds. This is a picture of Fiesta, which is one of our few biorational broadleaf selective products. This is on the list for Montgomery County, the approved list for Montgomery County. And basically, it's a chelated iron that has differential control characteristics where it will differentially control broadleaf weeds and not grasses. So this is one of the products that's being used in Montgomery County now. This is taken from the Virginia Cooperative Extension publication, Pest Management Guide from this year. And these are some examples of organic weed control products that are used for lawns. So we got things like acetic acid, which is basically vinegar. You can see here the product and then some of the uses. Ammoniated soaps of fatty acids. So this would be like a soap. These can also be used for as an insecticide, a lot of these. Citric acid, you can find this in Burnout. Burnout also has, or Burnout 2 also has clove oil. So you have citrus oil. That's sometimes you'll see this is D-limonene. Corn gluten really hasn't had much success here in Maryland that they had success with out in the Midwest for as a pre-emergent. Then you also have iron HEDTA. So this is basically chelated iron. You see this is in the Fiesta product, and this is one of the only biorational products we have as a selective pre-emergent or really suppression of broadleaf weeds. You notice if you read a lot of these organic weed control products are non-selective. So they basically work by burning back the leaves. And so they're going to burn back the leaves of the weed and they're going to burn back the leaves of grass. The unfortunate thing about a lot of these is that they just act on the leaves. They don't really translocate and move into the roots. So that's would be kind of the holy grail of organic control. If somebody could find an organic that actually translocates and moves into the roots, would be able to control, selectively control a little bit better. Chelated iron works to some extent. You're usually looking at 2 or 3 applications and basically just kind of trying to wear the weed down over time. And again, it's difficult because this doesn't translocate. But those are some of our organic, and I wouldn't say iron chelate's organic. I don't think it's technically organic, but it's what they call biorational. So really a less toxic product. So a couple of my favorites here, this Burnout. Again, this is a non-selective, works well. And a lot of these non-selective organics will work better when it's hot out. So it's going to work better when it's 85 than when it's 50. And again, a lot of these are going to require more than one app. But with these non-selective organics, you're going to get some collateral damage if you're putting this on the lawn. Not to say that's good or bad, but as long as you know it's going to damage both the grass and the weed. So let's look at pre-emergence. So typically in Maryland, we use a pre-emergent for summer annual grasses like crabgrass and goosegrass. Crabgrass germinates when soil temp is about 55 degrees for several days. Usually you're applying this product right around Forsythia bloom to maybe half green, half gold is your window. Although this year you had a long window because it stayed kind of cool and damp so long. So if it's still, if it's a situation where the soil temp might be 55, but air temps are consistently in the 60s, and you're still getting down to 50 or 40 at night, or 40s at night, crabgrass really isn't going to get going and be competitive. I know that several locations had a number of frosts even into April this year. So, I'm just now seeing crabgrass really get going here in the last couple weeks since Memorial Day, which is pretty late for us, but that's kind of nice. So, that said, a lot of people, in common wisdom is, oh, you got to put down a pre-emergent for crabgrass. I'm going to show you some data, some trials that we did at Maryland that show, if you've got a pretty dense lawn and you're mowing taller at say 3.5 inches or so and creating that shade, I would argue that you don't automatically need a crabgrass pre-emergent if you've got a dense lawn and you're mowing high. I think that it's, to some extent, it's people get caught up in these commercials and they caught up in, well, I've always done it this way. But I encourage people to think about, not pre-emerging if you've got a good, healthy, dense lawn and you haven't had a lot of problems with crabgrass in the past. Again, the best defense against crabgrass is good competition. Here's our common pre-emergent crabgrass herbicides. I did take this off of Michigan State website, but what I want you to show here is the common names. A lot of these trade names are valid. Some of them can change a bit, but really being able to look at the common name and the active ingredient on the label is the most important thing. So dithiopyr is interesting. This is the active ingredient to mention. This is actually a pre-emergent and an early post-emergent. So if you're a little bit late with going out and you have crabgrass starting to very early emerge, in the 1 or 2 tiller stage, Dimension will actually work on that at that point. Whereas these others are just straight up pre-emergent. Okay, so we also have barnyard grass, foxtails. These typically are not going to be competitive in a turf grass situation unless, unless they're, things are really thin. More of an issue in landscape beds, maybe without much competition, but just showing the relative temperatures needed for germination. So here's what our seedling crabgrass kind of looks like here as it starts germinating in the mid-spring. Here's what it might look like. Okay, here, so we've got between our plots, we don't have any competition, and here's your crabgrass. So if we have a situation where we have really warm temps, we have heavy rainfall, you're gonna see more crabgrass wanting to germinate. So crabgrass is a tropical plant that's native to places that have warm temperatures year-round and experience relatively heavy rainfall. So the more it rains, the more a pre-emergent product will break down and the more crabgrass seed will want to germinate. Okay. So really once we get into, it's been nice. We've had a couple cool days here in June. But really, when that crabgrass gets bigger, we really start to notice more in July and August. And again, in areas that are weak or not as competitive. Goosegrass, we don't see as much in home lawns. We see this more in athletic fields. It is an indicator of soil compaction. It'll usually germinate about 2 weeks or begin to germinate 2 weeks after crabgrass. Needs a little bit warmer soil temp into the low to mid 60s as opposed to crabgrass, which is mostly mid 50s. I'm going to zip through here pretty quick. So common wisdom with the pre-emergence is that you're going to have 6 to 8 to 10 weeks of control. If it's drier and it's cooler, you're going to have longer control. Wetter, warmer, you're going to have less control with these products. So you're going to apply it, and then that product will eventually break down, and you'll get to the point where you're below this threshold level. And common wisdom is to reapply, make a second application 8 to 10 weeks later if you're in a situation where crabgrass has been a problem in your lawn. So let's see. Took this slide from class, and it's got a few extra points we don't really have time to get into at this point. Okay, so as I mentioned, about 5-6 years ago, we did this mowing study. Actually, Dr. Turner did this mowing study. Basically, he took plots. He did not apply pre-emergent, and he mowed one plot at 4 inches, one at 3, one at 2, one at 1 inch. He subsequently split these out into different fertilizer treatments as well. But basically, he went through, here you are, midsummer. At the 1 inch mowing height, he had 85% crabgrass. 2 inch mowing height, he had 45% crabgrass. 3 inch, only 10%, which, you know, it's not great, but it's not bad. But then you crank it up to 4 inches, he had 1% crabgrass. So I'm guessing he doesn't have a 3.5 inch height, but I mentioned trying to mow tall fescue at 3.5 inches. I gotta believe that in an average year, even just by mowing, you're in single digits %, even if you didn't put down any pre-emergent. And again, in my opinion, I think there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of advertising with regards to pre-emergence. There's a lot of, oh, I've always done it this way, so I have to keep doing it this way. But I encourage you to think about, you know, if I've got a good stand, do I really need pre-emergent? So the other thing that's been kind of popping up in the last several years has been this Japanese stilt grass. Put the keys down here to give you an idea of kind of where it's at, be able to see it in this photo. So Japanese stilt grass germinates usually about 2 weeks before crabgrass. And this has been more of an issue on areas near woodlands, woodland borders, shady areas. Not as much. I mean, I'll see it occasionally in lawns that are in sun and relatively well cared for, but just really, it seems like this has popped up more in the last 2, 3, 4 years. So here we are. It's running rampant on the woodland border there. But same idea here is if you've got a problem with this in your lawn, it can be controlled with pre-emergence, but a little bit different thinking because people aren't used to applying a pre-emergent as early. Let's look at kind of post-emergent control of annual grasses. So this is a little tricky once they get bigger, but there are a couple active ingredient products that can be used for control of crabgrass and goosegrass. So here's your products of these. Homeowner-wise, probably quinclorac and sulfentrazone are what you find in most of the homeowner available mixes for these. So we also have post-emergent perennial grasses. So you can imagine that these are going to be a lot more difficult to control if you've got a perennial grass that survives from year to year to year, but you're trying to selectively control that perennial grass weed from the desirable perennial grass. So a couple of the common perennial grasses that we, that are sometimes troublesome here, going to be common type Bermuda grass. Sometimes people will call this a wire grass if it's a weed. Nimblewill, which is looks similar to Bermuda grass, but it's more common in shady or partially shady areas. And then if you're near a lot of ag fields, sometimes you'll have orchard grass. Of course, orchard grass is used as a pasture grass, forage grass. So sometimes this can escape and turn up in our lawn situation. So couple different products here, and this is going to be a difficult situation to control one perennial grass and another perennial grass. So if we look at our traditional broadleaf herbicides, again, just kind of want to kind of cover this so that you have a little bit of knowledge about our traditional broadleafs. Usually, these are consisting of products like 2,4-D, 2,4-DP, dicamba, mecoprop, quinclorac. A lot of times, they'll put these in mixes, 3 or 4-way mixes, because each of these active ingredients have work best on different groups of weeds. And so if you kind of combine these from a marketing standpoint, you're broadening your spectrum of weeds that can be controlled. In the last 10, 15 years, we've also had other actives such as panoxalam, triclobar, sulfentrazone, carbendazole. Carbendazole is actually been classified as a lower risk product. So in some of the newer mixes, this will actually take the place of 2,4-D, which is an older product and a little bit more toxicity. So carbendazole is going to be a little bit safer product in that regard. So when you go to buy these, a lot of homeowner options include these ready-to-use formulations where you don't have to do any mixing of the concentrated product. You just kind of point and shoot. As I mentioned before, these are really best to use as a spot spray as opposed to a blanket spray. Hopefully you'll be able to see this on the PDF. But again, this is from the Virginia Cooperative Extension publication. So it kind of shows what I was talking about with the different weeds and then the relative susceptibility to different herbicide combinations. When we think about the best time of year to apply broadleaf herbicides, it's a little bit bigger than I wanted it to be. Conventional wisdom, conventional wisdom usually you think about fall being a little bit better time than spring. Although with spring, there's something to be said for trying to spot apply to the new weeds that are smaller. But in general, we're going to find better, more effective broadleaf control if we're applying in the autumn. And that's because the product will get into the plant. The plant is in the process of preparing for winter and shunting carbohydrate down to the roots, and then that product can more easily get down to the roots. So if you've got a perennial, that's your goal, is to get that product down the roots. In the springtime, it all wants to grow up, so it's not going to translocate as well down to the roots. The other thing to think about too is that some of these conventional products have some volatility characteristics to them. And so if you have flowering landscape plants, that's going to make, of course, our landscape plants are broadleaf. It's going to make them more susceptible. So that's one caution to applying these products in the spring. The other thing, in the fall, you have cooler weather, it's going to be less volatilization. Now, that said, a lot of people are like, oh, it's spring, I got to spray. Again, if you can get the weeds when they're new, when they're small, then there's something to be said for that. But in general, pound for pound, you get a little bit better control in the fall than you do in the spring. Just wanted to mention nutsedge and its close relative Kalinga. These are pictures of nutsedge. Of course, nutsedge is going to have a 3-ranked leaf, so kind of a triangular leaf as opposed to a flat leaf that grasses have. Usually going to find these in damp conditions. They kind of fade into the background in the fall and the winter, and then you see these in the summer. A couple active ingredients that are within homeowner formulations include halosulfuron and sulfentrazone, and certainly these can be applied as a spot spray. I'm going to skip through these pesticide tips. I know you all have some training on this in some of your other modules. Just want to remind folks, don't apply, if rain's in the forecast, don't apply these products. Unless it's like a pre-emerge where you want to get that watered in. Don't spray when it's windy. We want to try to reduce drift. Don't apply when the soils are saturated. Plant won't be able to take it up as well. And then you risk more leaching with that. And certainly, be able to read and adhere to the label. Want to just make a few comments. Stephanie, we're getting up against time. I don't know if you can allow me an extra 5 minutes to 12:05 here.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So just want to talk a little bit about diseases. We don't have as many diseases on home lawns as we do on sports fields or golf courses, some of our more intensively maintained areas. But really, just like anything, like any pest, we want to be looking at our cultural control. So proper fertilization is going to be important to trying to suppress weeds. As I mentioned before, or to suppress diseases. As I mentioned before, if you have excessive fertilization in the summer, you can create some succulent growth, and that's going to make the plant more susceptible to summer pathogens because they like that new growth. The biggest thing with a lot of our diseases that are foliar diseases is doing what we can to reduce the leaf wetness period. So fungi need wet conditions for an extended period of time in order to infect the leaf. And so if we're watering at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the evening, and then that leaf is wet, and then it's wet all night, and we have humid conditions, you're just setting up a recipe for disease. If you water in the morning, that water dries off the leaf pretty quickly with sunshine, and then you're trying to alleviate the number of hours where it's where the leaves are wet. Mowing higher is going to help create a healthy plant. One thing we find with some of our diseases is that if you have a lot of stagnant air, stagnant air will be more humid. The disease pathogen, the fungi, like humid conditions. So if you've got like a pocket that's surrounded by trees and not a lot of air movement, you're more prone to have diseases in that type of a situation. And then sanitation, being able to make sure that you don't have excessive clippings on the surface. It comes back to if you're mulch mowing usually, but you have a lot of clippings, maybe you collect that time so you don't have a ton of clippings, or you go through and you rake the clippings. You don't want the clippings to smother the grass and create a micro climate of humid conditions. First line of defense really is looking at our disease resistant, or more of our disease tolerant. I don't know that we don't have any true disease resistant, but more disease tolerant varieties. If you go back and think back to that tall fescue list I showed pretty early on, in order for that to be on the list here in Maryland, those varieties had to have done fairly well with the tall fescue, with the brown patch evaluations. Brown patches are main disease on tall fescue. So if you're going to be a tall fescue worth your salt here in Maryland, if you're going to be on the recommended list, you have to be relatively brown patch tolerant, or else you're not going to do well here in Maryland. We vetted those via those variety trials. Currently, we're working on more research for more biological controls for suppressing pathogenic fungi. These are more used for golf courses, sports fields, professional. They're not as widely known by by landscape professionals. And again, they've been used more in sports turf and golf because we have more diseases in sports turf and golf. But there are a number of biologicals that we're looking at that definitely do help with suppressing disease. So a couple that I wanted to talk about really quick: brown patch, red thread, summer patch, and rust. And again, brown patch is our main problem of tall fescue. You find this on perennial ryegrass, golf-wise, creeping bentgrass. But this is really when we get into these hot, humid, chance of thunderstorms every day type of conditions where you're up, 85, 90 degrees. Nighttime temps are only dropping to, 68 or 72. It's cloudy. You have 8 to 10 hours of high humidity. More than 6 hours of relief wetness. 2 years ago, when we just had, it felt like it was raining, was going to rain, or it just rained, where we had 60 inches of rain that year. That's when we saw a lot of brown patch. Whether we've had over the last 3 or 4 days, not going to happen. Low humidity, temperatures down to the upper 50s at night, upper 70s during the day. That's basically perfect cool season growing weather. What you'll find with these brown patches is that you'll have these large, irregularly shaped areas, kind of a light brown to straw color. If you see the mycelium on the edges, that mycelium will be kind of whitish, and it'll fade to kind of this dark brown, gray on the edges. Big thing is you'll have leaf blighting. And then if you see the mycelium, it'll kind of look like this cobwebby appearance on the morning, and then once the dew dries, it'll kind of fade away, and only the microscopic mycelium will be present, but with the dew, it'll be more visible without a microscope. So basically, you have this leaf blighting. Typically, it doesn't damage the crown of the plant per se, but I mean, if you have a whole leaf that's dead, you're not getting carbohydrates, you're not doing photosynthesis, and then the death of the plant can kind of be a secondary effect of that. Now, if you just have this condition for, a couple days or a week, it'll eventually recover once weather gets a little bit better. Really, there's not a lot of people who would apply a fungicide for this on a home lawn. A couple high-end landscapers I know offer this service, but a lot of times it's a situation where it'll eventually recover once we get out of the hot and humid conditions. Red thread. This is I hope I have a picture of this on the next page. This is a fall or spring disease where we have cool, wet fall or spring weather. You'll see this pink to red mycelium, and then eventually it'll turn to straw color. Here it is. So this straw color here, sorry, I don't have any reddish mycelium, but you'll see kind of a red mycelium on the leaves early on. It'll fade to the straw color. And really the symptoms are most notable on the low fertility situation. So when I see this, instead of recommending a fungicide, I usually recommend folks apply 1/3 of a pound or 1/2 a pound of nitrogen, and usually that'll clear it up. Unless we're just, in a string of a month of days where we're at 50 degrees and wet, which rarely happens. So usually you can just fertilize your way out of this one. Summer patch, this is more of a Kentucky bluegrass disease. And the tricky thing is that this is a root disease. So by the time you start to see these symptoms, the roots are already severely damaged. So this is going to look like drought symptom a little bit. Of course, it'll form these patches, which tells you it's summer patch and not just drought. Drought wouldn't be this regular in these patches, but basically this is a root disease that infects the roots and then renders the roots incapable of bringing water up to the plant, and thus, very similar to drought symptoms. Again, this is more of an issue if you have a straight up Kentucky bluegrass situation. And most of our home lawns, you only have 10 or 15%. And then the other one I want to show you is rust. So there's a variety of different rust diseases. Rust diseases can be found on a number of different grasses. This is another one that's a low nitrogen fertility issue and is more prevalent in overcast and cool, moist conditions. So we have a stretch where it's in the upper 40s to mid 50s. It's cool, it's damp, it's cloudy. Here's your rust here. Again, I took this from my lecture series, so it's a little bit more detailed with description of the spores than perhaps necessary, but a little bit more technical, I should say. But basically, you have these pustules of this rust. And again, this is more a leaf issue. You can run into issues if you have, leaf blighting. It's going to take a little while for it to recover. But one of the things you can do is, again, fertilize, quarter-third of a pound of fertilizer, and that usually helps. So again, looking at disease tolerant and resistant varieties is going to be important. This is from a Virginia Tech publication. Nice little summary graph. We do, University of Maryland does have different extension bulletins on all of these diseases. This particular chart was kind of handy though, because it covers a lot of the common lawn diseases and then some of the common products. So really, again, with the rust and the red thread, you can kind of fertilize your way out of those. Just wanted to mention insects real quick. A lot of people are familiar with grubs. The way that you do scouting for this is you would do a little 1 foot by 1 foot square, peel it back, count. Usually if you've got 10 grubs or less, you're below the threshold level. Obviously this is a lot more than 10 grubs here. And so this is the type of symptoms that you'll see with, grass that's easy to pull up, no roots. For white grubs, there's a number of different species that kind of form this grub-like larva. In our area, our mass chafers and Japanese beetle are probably the most common. So here's the beetles that make up the grub complex. Those were the adults. These are the larvae. So we're used to seeing these Japanese beetle or mass chafer larvae that have the C-shape, kind of cream-colored, couple legs on the front side here. And the way that we can tell the difference is by actually looking at the pattern called the raster pattern on their backside. But these have a very similar life cycle. So these are going to go through from egg to larva to pupa to adult. So a lot of you probably recognize the Japanese beetle adult as a potentially big pest in our landscape realm. Doesn't eat turfgrass. For turfgrass, we're worried about this guy. In the landscape, we're worried about this guy. So basically the way these work are, they're going to overwinter as a third instar larva going down deeper into the soil so that they have some protection from the elements. As the weather warms up, the months are in blue here so you can't see them. We're now into March here. They'll go up during the spring. They'll chew on some roots as they get ready to pupate and grow. So they'll chew on roots in April, but usually the grass is growing pretty good. We don't have a lot of drought issues in April, so you might not notice it. And then they go through, pupate, emerge as an adult around June, start feeding on your rose family plants. They'll mate, lay eggs in the second part of July. And then as these larvae grow into second instar and third instar larvae, they'll start eating on the roots again as we get into late August and September. And this is when we can find some damage, because at this point, especially if it's been a rough summer, the root system's compromised. It doesn't take much to really start showing drought symptoms if you have a grub chewing on the roots. Now, the one thing we do see with grubs, though, is that they tend to be in the same place. So if you've had a problem before, that kind of makes it likely you're going to have a problem in the future. But I see a lot of landscape companies going out and just, oh yeah, we'll apply a preventative for grubs without even really doing scouting. So I encourage you to try to do scouting in the spring, kind of figure out, what your relative populations are. And if you don't have a problem, I think balanced fertility and adequate water do a lot culturally to prevent grub damage from becoming an issue. I mean, if you've got a ton of grubs, then maybe you would put out a treatment in the springtime to try to deter development of adults. Or the other thing you can do is a lot of times if you put out a preventative now, it will stay in place through the summer with a lot of our newer products. So a couple of different biologicals with these. Milky spore has been really mixed results. Some of the research up at Rutgers is looking at these entomopathogenic nematodes. So these are beneficial nematodes. So that's kind of encouraging to see. Those needs warmer soil temps, but these have a way of even if you don't totally control the grubs, if you're able to knock down the threshold levels or knock the population below threshold level, then that's going to be helpful. Drier conditions in very late summer, early fall are going to lead to a lot of desiccation of these new grubs. So it's kind of a careful balance because you want to water enough to keep your roots okay, but you don't want to water so much that you're encouraging grub population. So usually if you've got a healthy turfgrass stand, if you can keep things a little bit drier in late summer, that's going to be helpful. So chemical control, one of our newer, softer biorationals is going to be chlorantraniliprole, is going to be the active ingredient. Believe that on the market, that's the active ingredient in the product GrubX. But again, read your active ingredient labels. You would put this down in early May and it would last through the summer. And then for rescue treatments in the late summer where you didn't realize you had a problem until it's too late, some of these conventional actives are what's typically used. I didn't even get to lawn renovation. Gosh, Stephanie, I'm sorry, I just get talking.
There's so much to cover.
There's a lot to cover. If people want to hang on, so I will say this. There's a great section in the handbook regarding looking at sod versus seed versus seeding rates versus renovation. I've added a couple other slides here, but there's just there's some great great stuff in the handbook. The one thing that I don't know is really covered in the handbook is this. Just wanted to talk about this because a lot of times master gardeners are at tabling at the farmers market or this event or that event, and they get questions, and so just wanted to try to give you some questions that you might ask a client to try to help discern what's going on problem solving wise. So one of the things that I ask people when they're first coming to me with a problem, okay, is it sun or shade? What type of grass do you have? Now, most of the time, they don't really know. I mean, if they can bring you a sample, that's great. But, usually it's going to be tall fescue in our area. But if they don't know, it's kind of tough. Approximate age of the lawn. I mean, there's certain problems that we see with newer lawns than we do with older lawns. So a lot of newer lawns, maybe they didn't get fertilized enough to begin with to really get going. They put out, and so you don't have the good density from the start. You have weeds coming in. So sometimes that's a helpful question to ask. When did the problem first start? If you can correlate that problem to, oh, I had construction done. Oh, this is when the weather changed. oh, this is when I did something, sometimes that's a clue. And again, not that you need to ask all of these questions, but these are just questions that I hold in my quiver of inquisitive questions to ask to try to figure out what's going on. I also asked them about their fertilizer program. And a lot of, if I get a blank stare back when I ask about their fertilizer program, that's a pretty good indication that they don't fertilize. So, if you got weak, if they're asking about weeds and they don't fertilize, well, you can get rid of the weeds, but if you don't fertilize, they're going to come back. So again, I'm not the lawn police. I'm not going to say, you shouldn't have, if you want to have a few weeds, it's up to you. But I'm just saying from a agronomic perspective, if you don't want weeds, then proper fertilization is one of the cornerstone practices that have to be has to be consistently implemented. Soil type and conditions. This kind of relates to, is it wet, is it dry, is it poor soil, is it good soil, sometimes they may know, sometimes they might not know. If they're showing you a picture of a disease or an ailment, there's this, this, what we call a stand pattern. So, how does it look as you're looking, kind of across the lawn from maybe 10, 12, 6 feet away? And then how does that leaf look when you're just looking at the leaf and looking at the lesions in front of you? And then also, thinking about root depth and how that plays into plant health as well. So again, this is something that obviously, obviously comes with experience. I know that, there's a lot of great resources that you all have available, but these are just some of the questions that I try to ask people who are coming to me with problems, and 95% of the people don't articulate the whole situation. So you need to do a little bit of probing to try to get down to, what could be happening. Perfect example would be, I come in and I have, I've got these orange, my grass looks orange with this rusty stuff on. Okay, well, it's rough. How much do you fertilize? Oh, never. Well, if you fertilize a little bit, then that should alleviate it. So again, this is more of an experience thing, but hopefully these questions are helpful for you all to think about when you're out and about with the general public and trying to diagnose some issues. I think that's pretty much it. Obviously, Master Gardener website's great. Home and Garden Information Center website is great. Maryland Turf Council, we've got a lot of our Maryland Extension publications on that as well. So again, thanks. I really appreciate it. So I guess I should put my my email on here too. We can just a little bit about grassroots, but my email is here. I'll put it on the chat. It's pretty simple.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
Rinehart at umd.edu. So I saw a lot of highlights here in the chat box. I didn't read them, but
yes. So we do
have to siphon through those, Stephanie.
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions, and I think it would take a long time to get through all of them. So I have them all compiled into a document, and it may be easier for time's sake. I know a lot of people are saying they have to jump off. Yep. It might be easier if I send you the questions, and then I've added in answers for everything you've answered already, but you could add in your answers to the questions we didn't get to ask, and that could be posted along with the presentation. Does that work for you?
Sure.
Okay, great. So folks, that's what I'll do. If you put a question in the chat box, I do have it on my list, so don't worry. we will get it answered for you. Jean and I will work on getting up a link to the recording of the presentation, a PDF of Geoff's slides, and then also the Q&A document. And I've also copied all the links that were shared in the chat box into this document as well. So we'll have Q&A plus helpful resources that were shared throughout the presentation. All right, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up, and we'll send out this information to everybody so everyone can have it, and you can share it with your fellow master gardeners if they would like to use it as well. But thank you, Geoff, so much. That was so informative. I don't know if you can see all the comments. Everyone really enjoyed it.
So thanks, yeah.
There was so much to learn, so I really, really appreciate you doing this for us. And
yeah, I mean, remember, we teach a couple semester-long courses in this on campus, so I'm moving quick in 3 hours.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a lot to cover in such a short session. So I'm sure we'll be back in touch and we'll be hearing from you again.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.